Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the one thing that scared Golden Age pirates more than any Navy frigate, any storm, any hangman's rope, the Kraken, a creature whole crews swore was real, that a Norwegian bishop spent a career formally cataloguing, and that a French warship once spent 3 straight hours fighting with harpoons and rifle fire in 1861, coming home with only 40 pounds of it to show. We're talking about a Danish naturalist who was quietly right for 16 years before anyone believed him. A Royal Navy captain who staked his entire professional reputation on 20 honest minutes at sea in 1848. And a real animal, hiding in plain sight in water so deep and dark that it took until 2012 for anyone to actually film it alive. Welcome to 260 years of sailors staring into the deep, waiting to find out if the thing they feared was really down there. Dim the lights if you haven't already, and let a fan hum low in the background, something like wind dragging across open rigging at 2 a.m, salty below decks white noise. You're warm right now, dry, still, your own weight the only thing pressing down on you. That won't be true where we're going tonight. Where we're going, the sea itself is unreliable, it rises, it pulls, it remembers nothing, and the men who sailed it built an entire religion of small, careful habits just to survive not knowing what was underneath them. Let's ease into tonight's journey together. The grey had a texture to it that morning off the Lofoten coast, sometime in the middle years of the 1700s, the kind of drizzle that doesn't fall so much as hang, soaking through wool in a way that no fire fully dries out again. A fishing boat, 6 men aboard, oars shipped, drifting on water so still it looked less like sea than like a held breath. They were exactly where they wanted to be. That was the problem. Local knowledge said the fish gathered here in numbers found nowhere else on the whole coast, cod stacked so thick a man could nearly walk across their backs. Drawn up from some vast pantry beneath the boat that never seemed to run dry, no matter how many seasons it was fished. The boat's oldest hand, a man missing 2 fingers to a hook decades earlier, had brought his sons here every year of their working lives and taught them the 2 signs that meant it was time to leave immediately. Oars in the water, no arguments. The first sign was the smell, a stench like rotting fish drifting up from below, thick enough to make a man gag, arriving from nowhere on a windless day. The second sign was the water itself starting, almost imperceptibly, to rise. This is the story of the Kraken, the creature no 18th century sailor could produce in a net, in a jar, on a slab for inspection, and that pirates, merchantmen and naval officers alike spent 2 centuries half believing in anyway. Because the alternative was pretending the deep ocean had no secrets left in it. It didn't have that reputation by accident. It had it because a bishop wrote it down, because sailors kept swearing to it under oath, and because, as it turned out, 100 and some years later, there really was something enormous and unaccounted for living down there, just not quite the something anyone expected. Bishop Eric Pontoppidan of Bergen never claimed to have seen the Kraken himself. He was careful about that, in the way careful men often are right before they say something outrageous. In his 2-volume Natural History of Norway, published in 1752 and 1753, he gathered testimony the way a modern insurance adjuster gathers testimony, methodically, skeptically, from multiple independent witnesses who hadn't had the chance to compare stories. Ship captains, parish priests stationed along the coast, fishermen whose families had worked the same grounds for generations. Pontoppidan wasn't a sensationalist by trade. He was a naturalist trying to catalogue everything unusual about a country whose coastline ran for thousands of miles through fog, storm, and near total darkness for a third of the year. The Kraken was, in his telling, simply one more entry in that catalogue. Extraordinary, but no more extraordinary, he argued, than a country where the sun didn't set for 2 months running. The description he assembled from his witnesses was consistent enough to be unsettling. An animal so vast that at rest it could be mistaken for a chain of small islands, not metaphorically, but literally. Sailors reported anchoring near what they took to be a newly surfaced skerry, only to watch it submerge beneath them. Arms, and this detail recurs across nearly every account, independent of one another, thick as ship's masts, capable of wrapping around a vessel's hull and, if the crew didn't cut free fast enough, pulling it under. And the smell, always the smell, arriving before anything else, a stench strong enough that experienced fishermen used it as their early warning system. The way a modern sailor might watch a barometer. Word of it didn't stay in Norway, it couldn't have. The North Atlantic in the 18th century was one continuous shipping lane, and a story with this much staying power, backed by a bishop's own name no less, moved from Bergen to London to the Dutch trading ports within a matter of years, carried in the same holds as timber and salt fish and, eventually, in the same taverns where privateers and pirates traded rumours alongside prize money. By the time Golden Age piracy was in full swing in the Caribbean, decades after Pontoppidan's book first circulated, sailors an ocean away from Norway were still swapping Kraken stories on watch, the details shifting slightly with every retelling the way details always do. But the shape of the thing staying remarkably stable, something enormous, something patient, something that lived where the charts simply said deep water and nothing else. There's a piece of etymology worth sitting with here, because it tells you something about how old this fear actually is. The word kraken comes from an Old Norse root, krak, loosely meaning something twisted or gnarled, the same linguistic family that gives modern Scandinavian languages their word for an unhealthy stunted tree. Not a monster's name to begin with. A description of a shape. Somewhere along the way, the shape got attached to the sea, and the sea got a mouth. The legend is older than Pontoppidan by centuries, even if he's the name most associated with it. Medieval Icelandic sagas describe a sea beast called the Hafgufa, sea reek or sea mist. A creature so large that sailors who mistook it for an island were doomed the moment they lit a cooking fire on its back, because the smoke and the smell of food were exactly what drew it under. The 13th century Norwegian text Konungs Skugge, a kind of royal instruction manual for young princes, includes the Havgufa in its list of Greenland sea marvels with the same matter-of-fact tone it uses to describe walruses and pack ice, not as folklore set apart from the rest of the natural world, but as one more entry in it. By the time Pontoppidan sat down 500 years later, he wasn't inventing a monster, he was formalising one that had already outlived several kingdoms, and for a few years, taxonomically speaking, the Kraken was real. Carl Linnaeus, the Swedish naturalist whose classification system still organises every biology textbook on the planet, included the Kraken in the first edition of his landmark work Systema Naturae in 1735, filing it under the genus name Microcosmus, species Marinus. A sea microcosm. One creature, officially catalogued, sitting on the same shelf as barnacles and jellyfish. Here's the thing. Linnaeus quietly dropped it from later editions without much fanfare, the scientific equivalent of deleting an old social media post and hoping nobody screenshotted it. He never issued a formal retraction explaining why. He just stopped including it, and the scientific community mostly followed his lead, treating the Kraken from then on as maritime folklore rather than a documented species, though notably, nobody with an actual counter-explanation for what the fishermen kept describing ever stepped forward either. The Kraken didn't get disproven. It got quietly reclassified as somebody else's problem. Skepticism, where it existed, tended to come from men who'd never been north of the English Channel, naturalists working from armchairs in London or Paris, who found it easier to doubt an entire coastline's testimony than to explain what, exactly, was producing whirlpools large enough to swallow small boats and a stench strong enough to be used as a fishing signal. The sailors themselves were rarely the skeptics. If anything, they treated doubt as the luxury of people who had never actually watched the sea rise, where there should have been nothing but open water. A pirate crew working the Atlantic trade routes wasn't inclined to argue with a Norwegian fisherman's grandson about what lived in deep water pirates more than almost anyone else afloat, had a professional incentive to take the ocean's more theatrical warnings seriously, given how much of their livelihood depended on reading conditions correctly before anyone else on the horizon did. Consider a testimony recorded, in substance if not in Pontoppidan's exact words, from a merchant captain working the Bergen to Trondheim run in the years just before the Bishop's book went to print. The captain reported that his ship's boy, a lad of maybe 14, had been the first to notice the smell one still morning, and had said nothing for several minutes out of simple fear of being laughed at by the older crew. A detail that recurs in nearly every Kraken account of the period, and one that says something true about how these stories actually travelled. It usually wasn't the captain who noticed first. It was almost always someone young, someone low in the ship's hierarchy, someone with the least standing to be believed and the most to lose by raising a false alarm. By the time the boy worked up the nerve to speak, the water near the bow had begun, ever so slightly, to swell upward, and the whole crew went for the oars without a single order needing to be given. No monster ever surfaced fully in that particular account. That was almost always how it went. The Kraken's power, as a story, lay less in what anyone actually saw, and more in how completely everyone agreed on what to do the instant they suspected it was there. There's a strange comfort buried in that detail, if you sit with it long enough. An entire coastline's worth of fishermen and sailors, spanning generations, agreeing without any formal training on exactly what smell meant leave now, and exactly how much rising water meant you have perhaps 90 seconds. It wasn't panic. It was procedure, folk knowledge as tightly drilled as any modern safety protocol, refined over centuries by people who had nothing to gain from getting it wrong twice. Whether or not a genuine Kraken was ever really underneath any of those boats, the fear itself was disciplined, inherited, and crucially, it worked. Nobody in the historical record seems to have died ignoring the warning signs. They only died, on the rare tragic occasions the stories admit to, when the signs came too fast to react to at all. By the time word of the Kraken crossed the Atlantic and found its way into the taverns of Port Royal and Nassau, carried by sailors who'd served on North Sea whalers before switching to more profitable and considerably less legal work, the story had picked up new details the way sea ice picks up dirt, layer after layer compacting into something that looked ancient. Caribbean pirates weren't fishing Kraken grounds. There weren't any this far south, and most of them knew it. But they inherited the underlying anxiety wholesale, the idea that somewhere beneath an ocean too deep to sound with any rope aboard, something large enough to end a voyage in under 2 minutes might simply be waiting, uninterested in cargo, uninterested in gold, interested only in whatever happened to be floating directly above it when it decided to move. A pirate crew could outsail a naval frigate, out-negotiate a merchant captain, and outdrink nearly anyone in port. Against the thing Pontoppidan's witnesses described, none of that mattered in the slightest, and there is something almost humbling in how quickly hardened men who feared very little but walked or sailed on top of the water, handed over their courage completely the moment the subject turned to what might be underneath it. That, in the end, is what made the Kraken different from every other sea story pirates told each other to pass a long watch. Ghosts could be reasoned with, or at least avoided by staying off certain wrecks. Storms could be read in the sky hours before they hit. But the Kraken offered no warning that a sailor could act on, except the 2 signs the old fisherman taught his sons, a smell and a swell. And by the time either arrived, there often wasn't enough water left between the boat and whatever was rising to matter. It's a fear built entirely on the ocean's capacity to keep secrets, and no century of sailing, piracy included, ever fully closed that particular account. Not every skeptic stayed in London, and not every explanation offered was a dismissal. Some of the more thoughtful naturalists of the period, men who'd actually spoken with northern fishermen rather than simply reading about them second-hand, proposed something almost as strange as the monster itself, that whatever the sailors were seeing might be real, might be enormous, and might simply be a species of animal nobody in a university had yet examined up close. This was, historically speaking, the more accurate guess, though nobody involved could have known it at the time. The 18th century had no framework for a 60-foot invertebrate living a mile down in total darkness, because nobody had ever recovered enough of one to measure. What they had instead were carcasses, vast, rotting, unrecognisable masses that occasionally washed ashore on beaches from the Hebrides to Newfoundland, decomposed past any hope of identification, and promptly nicknamed by local communities the same thing their grandparents would have called them: Kraken speck, Kraken blubber. Evidence enough for people who already believed and utterly unpersuasive for people who didn't. It's worth pausing on how differently three separate kinds of observers processed the exact same set of facts, because it says something about how legends actually get built. A Norwegian priest recording testimony for his parish register wrote the Kraken down as an act of God's creation, remarkable but not troubling, one more strange animal among the puffins and the orcas. A London naturalist, working from that same testimony at several removes, wrote it down as a probable exaggeration, big fish made bigger by repetition. The way any fish story grows in the retelling, this one simply retold by an entire coastline instead of one proud angler. And a pirate quartermaster, hearing the story fourth hand in a Nassau tavern from a Dutch sailor who'd once served on a whaler out of Rotterdam, wrote nothing down at all. He just filed it away next to every other reason the deep ocean deserved more respect than the shallow water closer to shore, alongside waterspouts and reefs that didn't appear on any chart and currents that could carry ebb, becalmed ship miles off course while the crew slept. None of the three men were foolish. They were simply working from different evidence, filtered through different fears, and arriving, as people usually do, at the conclusion that best matched what they already needed to believe about the ocean. There's a version of this story, popular enough among later writers to be worth mentioning even though the documentation for it is thin, involving a Danish sea captain who supposedly kept a portion of ambergris, that strange, waxy, enormously valuable substance produced in the digestive tract of sperm whales, used for centuries in perfume making, that he claimed had come not from a whale at all, but from Kraken excretion, gathered from the surface of the water directly above the grounds where the creature was said to rest. Whether the story is strictly true almost doesn't matter for what it reveals. It shows how thoroughly the Kraken had been woven into the actual economy of the region, treated not as a spooky campfire tale confined to the hours after dark, but as a genuine, if terrifying, natural resource, something whose presence explained good fishing, whose proximity explained certain valuable finds, and whose temperament, so long as nobody disturbed it, could apparently be trusted not to interfere with a livelihood built directly on top of it. That's the detail that tends to surprise people most about the Kraken legend, once you sit with it a while. For 2 centuries, this wasn't purely a monster story. It was closer to a working relationship. Fishermen didn't only fear the Kraken, many of them in a strange and practical way depended on it, returning year after year to grounds their families had fished for generations, precisely because of what was rumoured to live beneath them. The fear and the livelihood were the same fear, the same livelihood, passed down together, one never quite separable from the other. You could make a good living on the Kraken's back for 30 years and never once see anything larger than an unusually large cod, right up until on the 31st year you didn't. By the time this legend reached its furthest edges, Caribbean taverns, Atlantic shipping lanes, the log entries of naval officers who would spend the next century arguing about sea serpents in far more temperate waters, it had already done the thing that all the best sea stories do. It had stopped being about any one bishop's book or any one fisherman's testimony, and had become instead a kind of shared inheritance, proof passed hand to hand across an ocean, that the deep water deserved the particular, specific, disciplined fear that generations of sailors had learnt to give it. Whether or not the exact creature Pontoppidan described was ever real in the form his witnesses swore to, something enormous really was down there, waiting for its own century to arrive and its own name to be given. That story comes later tonight. For now, the legend alone was more than enough to keep a hardened deck of pirates glancing over the rail on a still night, checking, the way sailors had been checking for 500 years, for the smell that came before the swell. Consider too how the legend travelled specifically through the print culture of the 18th century, because that mechanism mattered as much as the story itself. Pontoppidan's Natural History of Norway was translated into English within a handful of years of its original publication, and English translations of continental natural histories had a curious afterlife in the period. They got excerpted, summarised and reprinted in cheap pamphlets and almanacs, meant for exactly the kind of semi-literate audience that included sailors, dockworkers, and the occasional literate quartermaster who read aloud to the rest of the mess deck by lantern light. The bishop's careful, hedged scholarly account, full of qualifiers like it is reported and several credible witnesses maintain, arrived in a Bristol tavern, stripped of nearly all its caution, condensed down to the parts that made for good telling: the size, the smell, the swallowed ships. This is, in miniature, exactly how most legends actually spread. Not through the original document, which almost nobody reads start to finish, but through several generations of increasingly confident retelling, each one sanding off a little more uncertainty until what's left sounds less like testimony and more like fact. It's tempting, from 300 years' distance, to feel a little superior about all of this, to assume that a modern sailor, with satellite charts and sonar and centuries of marine biology behind them, would never fall for a story built on second-hand testimony and a bishop's careful hedging. But consider what these men were actually working with. No sonar, no aerial photography, no submersibles, no research vessels, no way whatsoever to see more than perhaps 60 or 70 feet into water that in places ran 2, 3, 4 miles deep. The North Atlantic seafloor in 1750 was, for all practical purposes, as unmapped and unreachable as the surface of the moon would be 2 centuries later, and unlike the moon, it was a place people had to sail directly over, day after day, for their entire working lives, trusting a wooden hull an inch and a half thick to keep them separated from whatever was actually down there. Given that gap in knowledge, the Kraken wasn't an irrational fear. It was, in a strange way, the most rational response available, an acknowledgement, dressed up in a monster's shape, that the ocean's depths were genuinely unknown, genuinely vast, and very probably home to something neither science nor superstition had properly named yet. History would eventually prove that instinct correct, just not quite in the shape anyone expected, and not for another 120 years. That was the myth pirates carried in their heads before they ever set foot on a deck of their own. But myths don't stand watch. People do, and what it actually felt like to stand, one, alone, on a becalmed sea at 2 a.m, with a story like that lodged somewhere behind your ribs, is its own kind of history entirely. The tar on the rigging is still warm from the day's sun when you take your place at the rail for the middle watch. And for the first few minutes, that's the only thing you're thinking about, the smell of it, sharp and resinous, mixing with salt and the faint rot of bilge water that no amount of pumping ever fully clears. Midnight to 4. The worst watch, and everyone knows it. The one where the body wants sleep more than it's ever wanted anything, and the ship is at its quietest, and the mind, with nothing else to do, starts filling silence with whatever it's been told to fear. You're 17 months into articles aboard a sloop running the trade lanes between Nassau and the Carolina coast, and by now the rhythms of watchstanding have worn themselves into you the way a groove wears into a well-used rope. You know the sounds the ship makes when everything is fine, the creak of the mainmast settling, the slap of water against the hull, the occasional snap of canvas taking a breath of wind it doesn't need yet. What you're listening for tonight, what everyone on this deck is quietly listening for, whether they'd admit it under questioning or not, is anything that doesn't belong in that list. Standing watch beside you tonight is Nathaniel Vance, 19 years old, a name you learned his second week aboard, and a story you learned in pieces over the following month, the way most stories aboard a pirate sloop get told, not all at once, but in fragments, between tasks when there's nothing better to fill the silence with. Nathaniel didn't choose this life the way some of the crew did. His merchant ship was taken off Abaco 8 months back, and rather than be marooned or pressed unwillingly, he'd signed the ship's articles, the actual written contract every man aboard had put his mark to, laying out shares, laying out discipline, laying out exactly what a man would be owed if he lost an eye, an arm, a leg in the course of the voyage. Signing hadn't been really optional, not in any practical sense. But it had been, at least on paper, a choice, and Nathaniel had made a point early on of telling you he intended to serve his time honestly and take his share honestly, the same as any man who'd signed by his own free will. You believed him. Most of the crew did. It's a small thing, being believed, on a ship where nearly everyone has a reason not to trust the man standing next to them. Here's the thing about a night watch on a pirate vessel that nobody quite prepares you for. It isn't dramatic. It isn't cutlasses and cannon fire. It's mostly this, standing very still, listening very hard, and trying not to think too specifically about what the old hands mean when they go quiet themselves at certain hours and refuse to whistle. By your second hour on watch, the moon has cleared the horizon enough to lay a long pale road across the water. And you understand, the way you've come to understand most things aboard ship, by watching what the veterans do rather than by being told outright, that whistling after dark is forbidden. Not discouraged. Forbidden with the kind of quiet, absolute certainty that superstitions earn themselves after enough near misses get attributed to them. The belief runs that a whistle after dark calls up wind, which sounds, on its face, like something a sailor becalmed for a week might actually want. But the wind a whistle calls, the old hands insist, is never the gentle, useful kind. It's a storm wind, or worse, the kind of wind that means something underneath the ship has noticed you and decided to answer. Nathaniel told you this his first week, delivered with the flat seriousness of a man repeating something he'd been genuinely warned about, rather than something he found silly. You've since caught yourself, twice, biting back a whistle out of habit alone. By the middle of the watch, close to 2 a.m, the wind drops to almost nothing, and the ship's forward motion slows until the wake behind her is barely a ripple. This is, by consensus of every hand aboard who's sailed longer than a year, the worst possible condition for a night watch. Not dangerous in the way a storm is dangerous, but dangerous in the slower, more insidious way that silence and stillness are dangerous, because they give a tired mind nothing to do except supply its own explanations for every small sound. Somewhere off to starboard, something breaks the surface with a soft, wet exhale, a sound every man on watch recognises half a second before their body finishes flinching, the unmistakable blow of a whale surfacing to breathe. Close enough that you can smell the faint fishy staleness of its breath carried on the still air. It is almost certainly a whale. Nathaniel says so himself, quiet and quick, the words coming out a beat faster than they need to, which tells you something about how close his own nerves are running tonight, despite the confident tone. Almost certainly. Nobody on deck relaxes until the sound repeats itself twice more, moving steadily away, and even then the relaxing is only partial. By 3 a.m, deep into the watch now, the kind of hour where even the ship's timbers seem to have gone quiet out of respect, a phosphorescent glow spreads along the waterline off the port bow. Pale blue-green light tracing the shape of something moving just beneath the surface, and for one full suspended second before your brain supplies the correct explanation, every hair on your arms stands up at once. It's bioluminescent plankton, disturbed into glowing by the movement of a school of fish passing through. Beautiful, genuinely beautiful. The kind of thing that under any other circumstance you'd call a crewmate over to see, purely for the wonder of it. Tonight, disturbed sleep and an unspoken shared fear turn wonder into something closer to dread for a good 10 seconds before the shape resolves itself and the fear drains back out of you, leaving you faintly embarrassed and considerably more awake than you were a moment ago. By 4 bells, close enough to dawn that the eastern sky has begun to grey at its edge, the quartermaster comes forward to relieve the watch, and you notice, the way you've started noticing small things about this crew the longer you sail with them, that he touches the rail with 2 fingers before he takes his position, a habit half the crew shares and none of them discuss. A kind of unspoken thanks to the ship, or the sea, or whatever's out there, that let the night pass without incident. Nathaniel does it too, automatically, without seeming to think about it at all. You find yourself doing it as well, before you've consciously decided to. 3 weeks out of Nassau, you learn where these particular habits came from, And the story, like most stories aboard this ship, arrives sideways, delivered not by anyone in authority, but by the ship's carpenter, an older man named Ambrose Dell, who has sailed these waters for the better part of 30 years and outlived 4 separate crews. He tells it while working, the way most of the crew's real history gets told, half attention on the plank he's fitting and half on the telling itself, which somehow makes it more believable than if he'd stopped everything to deliver it properly. The story concerns a Dutch merchantman taken as a prize some years back off the Florida coast, whose original crew, before capture, before any of this ship's current company had anything to do with her, had reportedly lost 2 men on a single becalmed night to something none of the survivors could describe with any consistency beyond big and fast and gone before anyone got a proper look. Ambrose is careful, in the telling, to hedge the story the way any experienced sailor hedges a second-hand tale, so it's told as I heard it, never once claiming to have witnessed any of it himself. But he delivers the ending with total conviction. The surviving crew, badly shaken, instituted the rail touch and the no-whistling rule that very voyage, and the practice spread from ship to ship along the trade routes the way practical superstitions always spread, carried not because anyone could prove they worked, but because nobody serving aboard those crews was willing to be the one who found out the hard way that they didn't. By your 4th week, the habits have stopped feeling like superstition to you at all, and started feeling like simple seamanship, the same category of practice as checking the bilge or trimming a sail properly, something you do not because you necessarily believe in the specific danger being warded off, but because the men around you believe in it enough that not doing it marks you as careless, and carelessness aboard a pirate sloop gets people genuinely hurt, monster or no monster. What happens below decks after dark? The quieter conversations. The older hands trading stories once the newer crew are meant to be asleep is a different matter, and one you'll come to understand more fully before this voyage is through. But that's not yet. By your 2nd prize taken, a Spanish sloop run down off the Bahama banks roughly 6 weeks into your time aboard, you've learnt enough of this crew's habits to notice how differently the fear of monsters sits next to the fear of everything else a pirate's life actually threatens you with. Nobody aboard treats the possibility of a kraken, or a sea serpent, or whatever unnamed thing lives in the deep water off soundings, with the same practical urgency they treat the very real risk of grape shot, or a snap line under tension, or the fever that swept through a ship 2 seasons back and took 11 men in a single fortnight. The monster is a background fear, a held breath fear, something acknowledged in small rituals rather than active planning. The gunfire is a foreground fear, planned for in drills, in cutlass practice, in the careful maintenance of powder kept dry against exactly this kind of morning. It's worth noticing which fear the ship's articles actually address, because it tells you something true about what these men considered manageable risk and what they considered simple bad luck no contract could cover. The articles, the same signed document Nathaniel put his mark to back in Abaco, lay out precise compensation for a lost limb in battle, typically somewhere in the range of 600 to 800 pieces of 8 for a leg, slightly less for an arm, more still for the loss of both eyes, paid out of the ship's common stock before any other shares were divided. There is no line in any surviving set of pirate articles compensating a man for having been frightened by something in the water. Some risks, even men who'd voted for their own captain and negotiated their own shares understood, simply couldn't be priced. The battle itself, when it comes, is loud and fast and over in less time than it takes to tell about it afterward, the Spanish sloop striking her colours within 20 minutes of the first warning shot across her bow, more interested in keeping her cargo intact than in dying for a captain who wasn't even aboard to see the fight. Nathaniel takes a splinter wound to the forearm from a near-miss chain shot, not serious, the ship's surgeon cleaning and binding it within the hour, with a mixture of rum, clean linen, and a confidence in his own competence that turns out, mercifully, to be justified. It's the kind of injury that becomes, within days, a story Nathaniel tells with more embarrassment than pride. The wound itself less impressive than the yelp he admits he let out when it happened, a detail the rest of the crew is delighted to keep bringing up at his expense for weeks afterward. This, too, is part of what actually held a crew like this together, not the grand loyalty of old friends, but the smaller, stickier bonds of shared risk, shared profit, and the running jokes that come free with both. Within a year of signing the articles, a milestone Nathaniel marks quietly, mentioning it to you almost in passing one evening while splicing rope, the kind of anniversary that means something to the man living it and nothing to anyone else aboard. The crew has taken 4 more prizes, weathered one genuine hurricane that very nearly ended all of your careers permanently, and lost exactly 1 man, not to any monster, not even to combat, but to a fever contracted after a run ashore for fresh water in a fetid Cuban inlet. His name was Obadiah Fenn, and his death, quiet, unglamorous, entirely undramatic, is treated by the crew with a solemnity that surprises you, given how casually they otherwise joke about mortality. His share, per the articles, is paid out in full to the shipmate he'd named before the voyage began, a cousin working the same trade lanes out of a different port, and the ship observes a single night without music before returning, the following evening, to exactly the raucous, ordinary rhythm of shipboard life as though nothing at all had changed. It has, of course. It always does. But a pirate ship, unlike a village, doesn't have the luxury of mourning for long. There's a voyage still to sail, and grief, like everything else aboard, gets folded into the working day rather than set apart from it. It's around this point in the voyage, nearly a year in, comfortable now in the ship's rhythms in a way you couldn't have imagined that first disoriented week, that you finally hear the full version of where the crew's phrase for death actually comes from. The one you've heard muttered dozens of times without ever quite asking, going to Davy Jones's locker. Ambrose Dell, predictably, is the one who tells it properly, this time setting down his tools entirely, which for Ambrose amounts to a kind of ceremony. The origin is genuinely uncertain, Ambrose says so himself, and he's right to. The term appears in print for the first time in a 1726 account by a novelist named Daniel Defoe, decades before Ambrose's own grandfather went to sea, and its actual roots are disputed among the sailors who use it, some tracing it to a corruption of Duffy, a West Indian term for a malevolent spirit, others insisting it honours or curses some specific long-forgotten dockside publican named Davy Jones, who was rumoured to drug and rob sailors before they ever left port. Nobody aboard this ship, Ambrose readily admits, actually knows which version is true, if either is. What they know is what the phrase means now. The ocean floor as the final resting place for anyone lost at sea, named the way sailors have always named the things they fear, with just enough black humour folded in to make the fear bearable. There is real tenderness in how carefully this crew treats the business of dying at sea, even wrapped as it is in gallows humour and a sailor's practised bravado. Nathaniel, months later, confides to you quietly one evening that his single greatest private fear isn't the Kraken at all, isn't drowning, isn't even the noose that technically awaits every one of you if you're ever caught. It's simply being lost without anyone aboard knowing exactly where or how, going over the side in the dark on some unremarkable watch, with nobody close enough to see it happen or mark the hour. It's a small, specific, deeply human fear, and you find yourself, without entirely planning to, promising him, the way you might promise a brother, that if it ever comes to that on your watch, you'll see it done properly, his name spoken, his share sent where he asked it to go, the night observed the way Obadiah Fenn's was. He doesn't say anything in response. He just nods, once, and goes back to the rope in his hands. That's how most of the important things get said aboard a ship like this. Not in speeches. In small, practical promises exchanged sideways, while the hands stay busy with something else. By the time your watch rotation brings you back to the middle watch again, nearly 18 months into the voyage now, the crew grown comfortable with each other in the particular hard-won way that only shared risk produces, the fear of the deep hasn't gone away exactly, but it's settled into something more like respect than terror. You still touch the rail. You still don't whistle after dark, not out of conviction exactly, but out of the simple accumulated habit of a year and a half spent not wanting to be the one who breaks a rule nobody can prove is necessary and nobody wants to be the one to test. Somewhere out past the edge of the moon's pale road on the water, in water deeper than any line aboard could sound, something that Bishop Pontoppidan's fisherman might have recognised instantly is very possibly going about its own business, entirely unaware that an entire maritime culture has spent 2 centuries organising its nighttime behaviour around the possibility of its existence. You'll likely never see it. Almost nobody ever did. But the not seeing, it turns out, was never really the point. The respect was the point, and respect aboard a ship this far from land, this far past the edge of any map anyone aboard could fully trust, was very often the only thing standing between a quiet, uneventful watch and a genuine disaster. There's one more habit worth mentioning before the watch ends, because it's the one that took you longest to understand, and once you did, the one that stuck with you most. Certain nights, never predictable, never announced ahead of time, the quartermaster orders a small offering thrown over the side before the ship gets underway again after a calm, a heel of bread, sometimes a splash of rum poured directly into the water rather than a man's cup, occasionally nothing more than a handful of the ship's own biscuit crumbs, tossed without ceremony from the rail. Nobody explains it as feeding anything. If you ask directly, as you eventually did, you get shrugs or half answers about tradition, or, from Ambrose, predictably the most forthcoming, a story about a Bristol whaling captain who never lost a man to weather in 20 years at sea and swore, till his dying day on dry land, that the habit of giving the ocean a small share of every meal was the entire reason why. It costs the ship almost nothing. A heel of bread is worth less than a minute's wages, and if there is even the smallest chance that some ancient, patient, unaccountable respect is owed to the water a ship spends its whole life balanced on top of, the crew has decided, unanimously and without ever holding a formal vote on the matter, that the cost of paying it is far lower than the cost of finding out the hard way that they should have. Dawn comes the way it always does after a night like this, first as a suggestion, a faint greying at the horizon's edge, then all at once the whole sky opening into colour while the ship's bell marks the change of watch and the smell of the cook's fire starts drifting up from below. Nathaniel touches the rail one more time before he goes below to sleep, and so, without quite meaning to, do you. Whatever fear the night held has folded itself back into ordinary daylight, filed away until the next dark watch calls it out again. That's how it worked, night after night, voyage after voyage, for 200 years of sailors, who never once got a clear answer to the question keeping them company in the dark. And it's a very different question from the one that would eventually, decades later, get an actual answer, cut loose off a rocky Newfoundland shore by 2 men with a boat hook and considerably more courage than sense. October 26, 1873. Conception Bay, Newfoundland. 2 fishermen in a small boat, close enough to shore to see the tree line, close enough that neither of them expected the morning to end the way it did. Theophilus Picot and his son Daniel Squires, the son actually a nephew by some accounts, though the record is consistent on both names, were hauling their nets when they spotted what looked, at first glance, like a half-submerged mass of wreckage floating low in the water ahead of them. Something worth investigating for salvage, if nothing else. They rowed closer. The wreckage moved. Here's what it actually was. Once they'd gotten close enough for the mistake to become impossible, a living creature, enormous, pale and reddish, with 2 long feeding tentacles trailing off its main body, and 8 shorter arms coiling and uncoiling with a slow, deliberate strength that made immediate sense of why nobody sane went looking for one on purpose. It seized the boat. One arm wrapped around the stern, and for a handful of seconds, no more, but long enough to burn itself permanently into both men's memory, the creature pulled, hard enough that the small boat began genuinely tipping. Daniel Squires didn't hesitate. He grabbed the boat's hatchet and brought it down on the arm gripping the stern, severing it clean through. The creature, whatever it made of the sudden loss, released the boat and sank beneath the surface, taking the rest of itself with it and leaving behind, draped across the thwart where it had fallen, a single amputated arm roughly 19 feet long. This is the story of the giant squid, the animal that spent 2 centuries hiding behind the Kraken's shadow, dismissed by serious naturalists as folklore dressed up in a bishop's careful prose, right up until 2 Newfoundland fishermen accidentally proved otherwise with a hatchet and considerably more presence of mind than the situation had any right to expect from them. The arm they'd cut free didn't stay in their boat for long. Pickett and Squires, understanding immediately that they'd encountered something worth more than a morning's catch, brought the severed limb ashore and eventually into the hands of a man whose name deserves nearly as much credit in this story as theirs. The Reverend Moses Harvey, a Presbyterian minister living in St. John's with an amateur naturalist's passion and, crucially, the scientific literacy to understand exactly what he was looking at. Harvey purchased the specimen, preserved it in a washtub of formalin in his own home. His wife's reaction to sharing living quarters with a decomposing sea monster arm is, unfortunately, not recorded for posterity, and set about doing the one thing no Kraken witness in Pontoppidan's Norway had ever managed to do. He photographed it. The photograph Harvey commissioned, taken with the specimen draped over his own body for scale, wasn't just a curiosity. It was proof, the first physical, reproducible, scientifically defensible evidence that something matching 2 centuries of sailors' testimony genuinely existed. Harvey sent copies to naturalists across North America and Europe, including to Addison Emery Verrill, a Yale zoologist who would go on to formally describe and catalogue several giant squid specimens over the following years, cementing the species' place in the scientific record for good. The Kraken, or something close enough to it that the distinction stopped mattering, had finally been caught, not alive, not intact, but undeniably, physically real, sitting in a Newfoundland preacher's washtub, while the rest of the world caught up to what North Atlantic fishermen had apparently known all along. The species already had a formal scientific name by the time Harvey's photographs made their way around the learned societies of 2 continents, though hardly anyone outside a small circle of Scandinavian naturalists had taken it seriously up to that point. In 1857, a Danish zoologist named Japetus Steenstrup examined a large, hooked beak that had been recovered from the stomach of a stranded sperm whale, along with fragments of skin and other tissue collected from occasional Danish coastal strandings over the preceding decades, and formally proposed the genus and species Architeuthis dux, roughly ruling squid, a name chosen with what turned out to be considerable foresight. Steenstrup's paper was met with polite, widespread skepticism. A giant, deep water squid capable of leaving marks like these was, to most of his contemporaries, exactly the kind of overreach that had already embarrassed Linnaeus a century earlier. It took the Newfoundland incident and the run of additional strandings that followed it along the same coastline over the next several years to finally settle the argument in Steenstrup's favour, 16 years after he'd first been right and largely ignored for it. Once the scientific community accepted that the animal was real, the actual anatomy turned out to be stranger than most of the folklore had guessed, and considerably more interesting for what it explained. Consider the eye. A fully grown giant squid's eye can measure up to roughly 10.5 inches across, nearly 27 centimetres, the largest eye possessed by any animal known to science, living or extinct, larger even than a blue whale's, despite the whale outweighing the squid by a factor of several hundred. The leading theory for why an eye needs to be that enormous in water too deep for any sunlight to reach isn't about seeing detail at all. It's about detecting the faint specific bioluminescent glow produced by one particular predator large enough to actually hunt an adult giant squid, the sperm whale, moving through the water at a distance. Giving the squid whatever narrow window of warning it might have to attempt an escape into darkness deeper still. An eye built, in other words, not to see the world, but to see one specific threat coming. And here's the thing about how we know sperm whales hunt giant squid at all. Since nobody has ever actually filmed the two locked in open combat in the deep water where it happens, the evidence is written directly onto the whales themselves. Sperm whale skin frequently bears circular scarring, sometimes dozens of marks clustered around the head and jaw, matching almost exactly the size and serrated pattern of a giant squid's sucker rings, each individual sucker lined with a ring of small, sharp, chitinous teeth designed to grip prey, and apparently more than capable of leaving a lasting mark on the thick hide of an animal, many times the squid's own weight. Whalers in the 19th century occasionally reported finding squid beaks indigestible, and therefore accumulated in the whale's stomach over years, in numbers running into the hundreds within a single animal. Direct physical evidence of just how central giant squid actually are to a sperm whale's diet, and just how frequently these two enormous, largely unseen animals must be meeting in total darkness, a half-mile or more, beneath any ship's keel. The buoyancy mechanism deserves its own mention, if only because it's one of the strangest solutions evolution has ever produced to the basic problem of staying suspended in deep water without expending constant energy to do it. Unlike a fish, which typically relies on a gas-filled swim bladder, the giant squid's body tissue is instead saturated with a solution of ammonium chloride, lighter than seawater, allowing the animal to hover at depth with minimal effort. It's an effective adaptation. It's also, incidentally, the reason giant squid flesh has a famously foul, ammonia-heavy smell and an almost universally poor reputation among the rare few fishing communities that have ever tried eating a stranded specimen out of desperation rather than curiosity. A detail that connects, in a strange roundabout way, straight back to those old Norwegian fishermen and the stench they swore arrived just before the water started to rise. They weren't smelling a myth. They may very well have been smelling exactly this. Size, inevitably, is where the legend and the science have had their longest-running argument, and it's worth being honest about where that argument currently stands, rather than simply repeating whichever version makes the better story. Reliably measured, scientifically verified giant squid specimens have topped out at somewhere around 43 feet in total length, tentacles fully extended, genuinely enormous, more than long enough to explain centuries of terrified testimony, but considerably shy of the mile-wide island Pontoppidan's fishermen described. Older, less rigorously documented reports occasionally claim specimens approaching 60 feet or more, and it's entirely possible, given how few of these animals have ever been examined intact, rather mangled by nets or partially decomposed on a beach, that even larger individuals exist somewhere in the deep ocean's considerable remaining privacy. What's disputed remains genuinely disputed. What's documented, though, is more than enough on its own. An animal the length of a city bus, with an eye the size of a dinner plate, arms lined with tooth-edged suckers, living its entire life in water too deep and too dark for any camera to have reliably found one alive until well into the 21st century. There's a particular kind of vindication in all of this for the fisherman whose testimony Bishop Pontoppidan spent a career carefully, patiently recording. Vindication that arrived roughly 120 years too late for the bishop himself to enjoy it, but vindication all the same. Every specific, consistent detail his witnesses gave him, the arms thick as ship's masts, the overwhelming smell, the sheer improbable size, turns out to map with striking accuracy onto an animal that genuinely exists, genuinely lives in the waters those fishermen worked, and genuinely was, by any reasonable standard, worth being afraid of. The only real exaggeration, if you can even call it that, was scale, not because the fishermen lied, but because fear, reasonable, well-earned fear, felt in a small open boat at the edge of unmapped water, has never once in human history undersold a story in the retelling. It only ever adds. New Zealand added its own chapter to this record in the decades following Newfoundland, with strandings along the coastline near the Cook Strait yielding specimens studied by naturalists including Henry Cheeseman, and additional finds turning up periodically along the coasts of Ireland, Norway and Japan across the following century, enough accumulated physical evidence, gathered piece by piece from beaches rather than captured deliberately, that by the early 20th century no serious scientist doubted the giant squid's existence any longer, even while its living behaviour in its own natural habitat remained almost entirely a mystery. That mystery, as it happens, wouldn't get solved by a hatchet-wielding fisherman or a patient Danish zoologist working from a single recovered beak. It would take modern deep-sea camera technology, over a century of additional waiting, and one remarkably persistent Japanese marine biologist working in cooperation with a documentary film crew, a story that belongs later in this telling. Once you've spent a little more time with the men who sailed these same waters, not with cameras, but with cutlasses, cargo holds, and every reason in the world to fear whatever might be waiting for them in the deep water they had no choice but to cross. Before Steenstrup, before Newfoundland, before the science settled into anything resembling consensus, there was a Frenchman named Pierre Denis de Montfort, and his story is worth telling here precisely because of how badly it went for him, a cautionary tale about the difference between being right about something and being credible while saying it. In 1802, Montfort published a work describing what he called the colossal octopus, compiling sailors' accounts of enormous cephalopods capable, he claimed, of attacking and sinking full-sized ships. He went further than the evidence could support even by the loose standards of the day, citing a supposed 1782 incident in which a colossal octopus had allegedly dragged an entire French warship, crew included, beneath the waves off the coast of Angola, a claim with essentially no independent corroboration, and one that Montfort appears to have taken largely on faith from second-hand sailors' testimony rather than any verifiable record. The scientific establishment of Paris, already primed to be sceptical of exactly this kind of story after decades of debunking mermaids and sea serpents, tore the claim apart, and Montfort's reputation went down with it. He died in poverty roughly 18 years later, largely discredited, remembered for decades afterward as a cautionary example of a naturalist who'd let sailors' tall tales get the better of his judgment. Here's the uncomfortable footnote history eventually attached to Montfort's disgrace. He wasn't entirely wrong about the animal existing. He was wrong about the ship sinking, almost certainly wrong about the scale of the specific 1782 incident, and badly wrong to present second-hand tavern testimony with the same confidence he might have given a dissected specimen. But the underlying claim that an enormous, previously uncatalogued cephalopod existed and was occasionally encountered by sailors in open water turned out, 71 years later, to be substantially correct, vindicated by the very same species of animal Steenstrup would name and Pickerton Squires would encounter first-hand in Conception Bay. Montfort's failure wasn't in the existence of the creature, it was in the standard of evidence, and it's a distinction worth sitting with. Being right about the big picture doesn't excuse getting the specific facts wrong, and the two men who actually advanced this science honestly, Steenstrup with his careful beak analysis, Harvey with his sober photograph, succeeded precisely where Montfort failed, by refusing to claim more certainty than their evidence could support. There's an even older account worth mentioning, though it comes with its own thick layer of legend that's difficult to fully strip away. Along the Irish coast near Dingle, local tradition preserved stories, predating even Pontoppidan's Norwegian testimony by several decades according to some tellings, of massive sea creatures encountered by fishing boats working the deep water off the Kerry coast. Stories similar enough in their broad strokes to the Scandinavian Kraken accounts that some later folklorists have proposed a shared cultural route, sailors and fishing communities across the whole North Atlantic independently encountering, and independently mythologizing, the same genuinely enormous animal from opposite sides of an ocean neither community had any real contact with. Whether that connection holds up to close historical scrutiny is, honestly, disputed. The Irish material is thinner and less consistently documented than Pontoppidan's careful Norwegian collection, but the pattern itself is suggestive. Wherever European sailors worked genuinely deep, genuinely cold water for long enough, something remarkably similar to the same story eventually took root. It's worth pausing here to untangle a common modern confusion, since the giant squid isn't actually the largest squid known to science, even though it's by far the more famous of the two. The colossal squid, Mesonicoteuthis hamiltoni, first formally described in 1925 from a partial specimen recovered from a sperm whale's stomach, much like the giant squid's own earliest evidence, is believed to be heavier, if somewhat shorter in overall length, distinguished most dramatically by swivelling hooks lining portions of its tentacles, rather than the giant squid's simple toothed succus alone. living almost exclusively in the frigid waters of the Southern Ocean around Antarctica, far from the traditional North Atlantic shipping lanes where Kraken folklore took root. The colossal squid never made it into European sailors' testimony the way its northern cousin did, simply because almost nobody sailed those particular waters regularly enough to encounter it. Two enormous deep-water cephalopods, each large enough on its own to explain centuries of monster folklore, living at opposite ends of the same ocean system, one famous and one comparatively obscure purely as an accident of which shipping routes happened to cross its territory. It's a reminder worth holding on to. The ocean has never been shy about hiding enormous things in plain sight, so long as plain sight means several thousand feet of freezing, lightless water that almost nobody has ever had the means or the reason to visit. By the early 20th century, with the giant squid's existence firmly established and additional specimens turning up with some regularity along beaches from Newfoundland to New Zealand to the coast of Japan, the scientific community faced a new and in some ways more humbling problem, despite having settled the question of whether the animal existed. Nobody had the faintest idea how it actually lived. Every single specimen examined for well over a century, every stranding, every whale stomach fragment, every net-caught remnant, arrived dead, damaged or dying, telling scientists a great deal about giant squid anatomy, and essentially nothing about giant squid behaviour. Did it hunt actively, or lie in wait? Did it live solitary, or in loose groups? How did it actually move through open water? And how did it actually fight, if it fought at all, against the sperm whales whose scarred hides suggested regular and violent encounters? More than 100 years after Pickett and Squires brought their severed arm ashore, these questions remained essentially unanswerable, because nobody had ever managed to film, or even reliably observe, a living giant squid in its own natural habitat. The technology simply didn't exist to survive the pressure, the darkness, and the sheer difficulty of finding one animal in an ocean covering roughly 70% of the planet's surface. Consider briefly how strange this actually is from a modern vantage point, because it's easy to lose the sense of wonder in a list of dates and scientific names. Human beings had, by the early 20th century, mapped the surface of the moon in more useful detail than they had mapped the behaviour of the largest invertebrate on their own planet, an animal not hiding on some distant, inaccessible world, but sharing the same ocean that carried Golden Age pirates' sloops between prizes, the same water that Nathaniel Vance and Ambrose Dell and every nameless lookout on every nameless ship spent 2 centuries quietly, ritually respecting without ever being able to prove exactly what they were respecting. The giant squid didn't need to be exotic to remain mysterious. It only needed to live somewhere humans genuinely couldn't follow, and for the better part of a century after its existence was scientifically settled, that was more than enough to keep it as much a creature of imagination as of biology, no longer a kraken exactly, no longer quite a myth, but not yet either something anyone alive had actually watched move through its own world on its own terms. That gap between knowing an animal exists and actually understanding how it lives is, in its own way, a modern echo of the exact gap Bishop Pontoppidan's fishermen lived inside 2 centuries earlier. They knew something enormous moved beneath their boats. They had no way to study it, only to respect it, and to build their working lives carefully around the edges of what they didn't understand. It would take until the early 21st century, and one of the more patient and quietly remarkable feats of modern marine biology, before that particular gap finally started to close. But that story deserves its own telling later tonight, once you've spent a little more time first with the ships and the crews and the particular. Specific dread of being becalmed in open water with absolutely nothing to do but wait, and wonder, and listen. The relief giving way to dread, and dread eventually giving way to something almost like reverence, that was the shape of a night watch under a superstition nobody could prove and nobody dared ignore. A dead calm asks something harder of a crew. It asks them to sit still, for days at a time, with nothing to do but wait for a wind that may or may not come, and to fill that waiting with whatever their minds decide to supply. The first thing you notice, on the morning it starts, is the silence where the sound of moving water should be. You've slept through 6 months of steady wind by now. The hull's constant conversation with the sea worn so deeply into your sleeping mind that its absence wakes you before your eyes even open. You come up on deck to a horizon flat as poured glass in every direction, the sails hanging dead against the masts, the whole ship sitting motionless on water so still it holds the sky's reflection almost without distortion. Blue on blue on blue for as far as you can see. It's beautiful for about an hour. Then it's simply a problem. The ship's quartermaster, a freedman named Cudjoe, who escaped a Barbados sugar plantation 11 years back and has sailed under pirate articles ever since, voted into his position by the same crew he now helps navigate, his share equal to any man's who signed the same document, is the first to say aloud what everyone else is already privately calculating, how many days of water remain in the casks below, and how few of them can be spared for anything but drinking. Cudjoe has crossed becalmed water before, more than once, and he moves through the ship's routine of rationing with a calm efficiency that does more to steady the crew's nerves than any speech could have. He measures the water himself, twice a day, marking the level against a notch cut into the cask's inner stave, and he says the number out loud each time, not to alarm anyone, but because he's learned, the hard way, that a crew left to imagine the worst on their own imagines something considerably worse than the truth usually turns out to be. By the second day of the calm, the heat has become the dominant fact of shipboard life. The sun sitting directly overhead for hours with nothing, no wind, no cloud, no forward motion to generate even the illusion of a breeze. To cut it. Pitch softens in the deck seams underfoot. The ship's few remaining livestock, penned near the bow, grow lethargic and quiet in a way that unsettles the crew more than their usual noise ever did. You spend the worst hours of the afternoon in whatever shade the sails can be rigged to provide, doing the kind of small, repetitive maintenance work that exists specifically to give idle hands something to do, recalking seams that don't strictly need it yet, restitching sailcloth that's still perfectly serviceable, because Cudjoe and the ship's captain both understand something about boredom that newer crew members rarely appreciate until they've lived through it themselves. An idle pirate crew, trapped together with nothing to occupy them, is far more dangerous to itself than almost any external threat the voyage might otherwise produce. By the third day the old superstition surfaces, the way it always eventually does on a calm this stubborn, and it surfaces first, as these things so often do, from the youngest and least senior hand aboard, a boy of perhaps 13 named Elkanah Rice, who signed on as ship's cabin boy back in Nassau and has spent the whole voyage so far trying, visibly, to prove he belongs among the older hands. Elkanah suggests, quietly at first, and then with more conviction once nobody immediately laughs at him, that the calm itself might be the Kraken's doing, that something enormous, resting directly beneath the ship's keel, might be responsible for the total absence of wind and current both. The water stilled the way a held breath stills a room. It's not strictly an unreasonable theory by the logic of the era. Sailors across 2 centuries genuinely believed that certain calms carried a different quality than others, a stillness too complete, too total, to be entirely natural, and whether or not the science behind that belief held up, the ships that survived long enough to pass the superstition down were, notably, the ones that took every unusual calm seriously rather than dismissing it as ordinary weather. By the 4th day water rationing has tightened to 1.5 pints per man, and tempers, inevitably, have begun tightening along with it. A shoving match breaks out between 2 hands over what one of them insists was an unfairly measured ration, nothing serious, nothing that draws blood. But serious enough that Cudjoe steps between them personally, rather than leaving it to lesser authority, and serious enough that the captain, watching from the quarterdeck, makes a point of announcing, loudly enough for the whole deck to hear, that the next man who starts a fight over rations will forfeit his share of whatever prize the voyage eventually takes. It's not cruelty. It's the ship's articles doing exactly the job they were written to do, providing a clear, agreed-upon consequence that exists specifically so violence doesn't have to fill the silence where one isn't otherwise available. By the 5th day, well into the hottest and most dangerous stretch of the calm, something breaks the water's surface roughly 200 yards off the port bow, and for one full suspended second the entire deck goes silent, every hand aboard turning toward it at once with the particular, total attention of men who have spent 5 straight days half expecting exactly this. It's a dark, curved shape, rising and falling with a slow, deliberate rhythm, trailing a faint spray with each surfacing breath. Elkanah, predictably, is the first to say the word nobody else wants to say first. And for a moment, just a moment, you feel your whole body go cold despite the relentless heat, the old inherited fear from 100 generations of sailors rising up all at once, faster than any rational thought can catch up to it. It's a sperm whale. Cudjoe says so within seconds, his voice deliberately calm, deliberately loud enough to carry across the whole silent deck. And he's right. The shape resolves itself soon enough into the unmistakable blunt square head and the distinctive angled spout of a whale surfacing to breathe after a long dive. Entirely uninterested in the becalmed ship sitting motionless a couple 100 yards distant. It's actually good news, Cudjoe points out once the collective breath has been let out. Though it takes the crew a moment to see it his way, a sperm whale this far from any known feeding ground, diving this deep and this long between breaths, is very possibly hunting exactly the kind of prey that lives in the same cold deep water old sailors have always associated with the Kraken. If anything enormous really is resting somewhere beneath the ship right now, the whale's presence suggests it has other business to attend to. It's not comfort exactly. But on the 5th day of a dead calm, with rations tightening and nerves fraying, it's close enough to comfort that the crew takes it. By the 6th day, the calm has stretched past the point where anyone aboard, even Cudjoe, has direct personal experience to draw comfort from, and the ship's mood has curdled into something the captain recognises immediately and moves fast to address, because he's seen it before on other voyages and knows exactly how quickly it can turn into something the articles alone can't contain. He calls the crew together on deck, not a formal muster, nothing that would spook anyone further, just an ordinary seeming gathering, and does the one thing that experienced captains across the whole era of piracy consistently understood better than almost any other leadership skill of the period. He tells them, plainly and without exaggeration, exactly how bad things actually are, and exactly what the plan is if the calm doesn't break within another 2 days. Water can be further rationed. A course correction, rowing the ship's boats to tow her toward a current known to run somewhat further south, is possible if difficult. Nobody is going to die of thirst before other options run out. It's not an inspiring speech. It doesn't need to be. What it does is replace the crew's imagination, always the most dangerous thing aboard a becalmed ship, with an actual plan, and a plan, even an unpleasant one, is almost always less frightening than the alternative it replaces. By the 7th day, a thin, uncertain breeze finally begins stirring the slack canvas overhead, barely enough to notice at first, confirmed only by the faint creak of rigging taking up tension it hasn't held in a week. The relief that moves through the ship in that moment is close to physical, a collective exhale you can almost hear across the whole deck, men who haven't smiled in days suddenly grinning at each other for no better reason than moving air. Elkanah, characteristically, is the first to say out loud what several of the older hands are clearly thinking, but too proud to voice themselves. That whatever had been holding the wind back, real monster, ordinary weather, or simple bad luck, has apparently decided to let go. Within the hour, the ship is properly underway again, water hissing along the hull in that familiar, comforting conversation you hadn't realised how much you'd missed until it returned. Cudjoe orders the water ration eased back toward normal, marks the cask level one final time for the voyage's log, and allows himself, for the first time in a week, something close to visible relief. That night, on watch, you find yourself doing the old habit without thinking about it at all. 2 fingers touched to the rail, a small unspoken thanks to a sea that had, after 7 days of testing everyone's nerve, finally decided to let the ship move again. Whatever had actually caused the calm, and nobody aboard, from the captain down to Elkanah, could honestly claim to know for certain the crew had gotten through it the same way pirate crews got through most things. Not through courage exactly, and not through faith exactly, but through the plain, practical discipline of rationing, patience, and each other, with the old fear of the deep sitting quietly in the background the entire time, neither confirmed nor denied, exactly where it had always lived. There's a piece of Cudjoe's own story worth telling here, because it surfaces during the calm in a way it hadn't before, in one of the long, idle stretches of the fourth day, when there's nothing to do but talk, and the heat has made everyone a little more forthcoming than usual. He tells you, without much drama in the telling, about the crossing that first brought him to the Caribbean as a young man. Not this crossing, not any voyage he chose, but the Middle Passage, packed below decks on a slaver out of West Africa, in conditions he describes only briefly, and only once, before changing the subject himself. He tells you about the plantation in Barbados, about the 11 years he spent there, about the night he and 3 other men finally slipped away during a hurricane's chaos, when the overseers were too occupied with their own survival to watch the fields closely. He tells you, with something closer to pride than bitterness, about reaching a pirate crew 2 years later, a crew willing to let any man who could pull a rope and hold a course sign the same articles as everyone else, vote in the same elections, draw the same share. It's not a story he tells for sympathy. He tells it, you come to understand, because the calm has stripped away the ordinary busyness that usually keeps a man from dwelling on where he's actually been, and because, of everyone aboard, you're the one who happened to be sitting closest when the mood struck him to finally say it out loud. You don't say much in response. There isn't really anything adequate to say. You just listen, the way the moment seems to be asking you to, and something between you shifts a little, quietly, the way it does when someone hands you a piece of themselves they don't hand around easily. The near mutiny, when it fully surfaces on the 6th day, deserves a slightly closer look than a single shoving match, because it's worth understanding exactly how close it actually came to something more serious, and exactly what stopped it. A small knot of the crew, 4 men, all relatively new to the ship, none of them party to the original articles negotiated when the voyage began, start murmuring, quietly at first and then less quietly, that the captain's plan to row the ship's boats toward a hoped-for current is a fool's errand, a waste of strength and water both on a gamble no better than simply waiting. It's the kind of grumbling that, left unaddressed for another day or two, has genuine potential to curdle into something the ship's articles were specifically written to prevent, an unauthorized challenge to the captain's authority outside of the proper voted process the crew had agreed to when they signed on. Cudjoe handles it directly, pulling the loudest of the 4 men aside and reminding him, calmly, without threat, but without any softness either, that the articles provide an actual mechanism for challenging a captain's decisions if the crew genuinely believes he's leading them wrong. A vote, called openly, decided by the whole company together, exactly the same process that put this captain in command in the first place. Grumbling in corners isn't that process. It's just noise, and noise, Cudjoe points out, has never once gotten anyone through a dead calm faster. The man doesn't apologize exactly, but the grumbling stops, and no formal vote is ever called. It's a small moment, easy to miss in the larger drama of the week, but it's exactly the kind of small moment that decided, again and again across the whole era of piracy, whether a crew survived its hardest stretches intact, or came apart from the inside before the weather or the water or anything external ever got the chance to finish the job. There's a ritual worth mentioning too, one that surfaces specifically during long calms and nowhere else in the ship's ordinary routine, on the 5th evening, with tempers still raw and the sun just beginning its slow drop toward the flat, unbroken horizon. The captain orders the ship's few remaining spoiled provisions, a cask of biscuit gone soft with damp, the last of a barrel of salt pork too far turned to safely eat, heaved over the side rather than simply discarded below decks the way spoiled stores usually would be. It's presented officially as ordinary housekeeping, clearing space and weight from a hold that needs neither in a calm, but every experienced hand aboard recognises it for what it also is, an offering, deliberately timed. Deliberately visible to the whole crew, a larger and more formal version of the heel of bread ritual you'd already learned to recognise on quieter nights. Whether the sea actually notices or cares is, of course, entirely unprovable, and nobody aboard pretends otherwise. But a crew 5 days into rationed water, watching their captain choose to feed the very ocean that seems to be holding their wind hostage, takes a particular kind of comfort from the gesture regardless. Comfort less about the ocean's reaction, and more about watching their own leadership take the threat, whatever it actually was, seriously enough to act on it. By the time the wind finally does return on the 7th day, the calm has cost the ship 6 days of forward progress, roughly a third of its remaining fresh water, and, in the ledger that mattered most to the men actually living through it, considerably more nervous energy than any single storm the voyage had weathered up to that point. Storms, at least, were fast. A storm gave a crew something to fight. Hands busy, danger immediate and physical and over within hours one way or another. The calm had offered nothing to fight at all, just days of stillness and heat and rationed water and an old fear with nowhere productive to go, and by the time it finally broke, more than one hand aboard privately admitted, quietly, to Cudjoe or to each other, that they'd take a proper storm over another week like that without hesitation. It's a strange thing to learn about fear, out on open water far past any coastline, that the quiet, patient, unprovable kind is very often harder on a crew than the loud, obvious, immediate kind. Precisely because there's no clear enemy to meet it with. The Kraken, if it was ever really the Kraken at all, had never needed to surface, never needed to so much as brush the hull. It had only needed to hold the wind still for a week and let 7 days of a crew's own imagination do the rest of the work. You'll carry that particular lesson with you longer than almost anything else this voyage teaches. Oddly enough, not a lesson about monsters at all. In the end, but a lesson about waiting, and about what waiting does to people when it's stretched past the point where courage or discipline alone can carry them through it. Cudjoe tells you, on the last night of the calm, watching the newly filled sails finally hold a genuine shape against the darkening sky, that he's weathered 5 calms in his 11 years at sea, and that every single one of them taught him some version of the same thing. The sea rarely kills a crew outright during a calm. It simply waits to see what the crew will do to itself first, and it is, in Cudjoe's own quiet phrase, remarkably patient about it. You think about that a long while after he's gone below to sleep, standing your own watch under a sky finally. Mercifully full of moving air, the old fear of what might be resting somewhere beneath the keel, folded now into something calmer, something closer to simple respect. The same respect, you realise, that a man like Cudjoe had clearly been carrying with him long before any of this voyage began, earned the hard way, on water considerably less forgiving than this. That respect for what waits in stillness carries forward into every account of the deep water that follows, including, decades later and half a world away, the testimony of a Royal Navy captain who would find himself staring at something in open water that no amount of rationing or patience could easily explain away as a whale. A sighting so specific and so well corroborated that it would end up debated in the pages of London newspapers for months. August 6th, 1848. The South Atlantic, roughly halfway between the Cape of Good Hope and the remote island of St. Helena. 4 officers on the quarterdeck of Studless, a 21-gun Royal Navy frigate homeward bound from the East Indies, all 4 of them looking at the same thing at the same time, and none of them, initially, quite believing it. Captain Peter McQuay, a career naval officer with no particular reputation for exaggeration or credulity before this voyage, and notably none afterward either, would later put his account in writing to the Admiralty itself, a formal, sober document, not a sailor's tavern story, submitted through the Navy's own chain of command, with his professional reputation directly attached to every word of it. Here's what he reported seeing: an enormous serpentine creature, moving through the water at a speed he estimated at 12 to 15 knots, its head and shoulders held roughly 4 feet clear of the surface, a body he judged to be somewhere between 60 and 70 feet long, visible above the waterline alone, passing close enough alongside the ship, near enough, in his own words, that had it been a man of his acquaintance, he would have recognised his face at the same distance. It held course for roughly 20 minutes before disappearing astern, never diving, never behaving like any whale, seal, or known fish any officer aboard could readily identify. This is the story of the Daedalus sea serpent, not the Kraken exactly, not quite the same creature Norwegian fishermen had spent a century describing to Bishop Pontoppidan, but a close and telling cousin in the long, tangled history of things sailors swore they'd seen in open water that the rest of the world back on dry land refused, at first, to believe. The report itself, once it reached London, became something considerably larger than a single captain's logbook entry. Maquet's account was formally submitted to the Admiralty on October 6, 1848, exactly 2 months after the sighting, the delay itself a matter of ordinary naval procedure rather than any hesitation on the captain's part. Once it reached the public through the Illustrated London News, which published both Maquet's written description and an accompanying engraving, based directly on a sketch the captain himself had provided, the story spread through Victorian Britain with a speed that would have been genuinely impressive even by the standards of a much later century's news cycle. Here was a serving Royal Navy captain, backed by 3 corroborating officers, describing an animal that matched nothing in any existing zoological catalogue, in language too precise and too restrained to easily dismiss as a drunken sailor's tale. The British public, primed by decades of Arctic exploration narratives and colonial-era natural history discoveries to believe the world still held genuine unclassified wonders, largely took the sighting at face value, and newspapers across the country ran and reran the story for weeks. The scientific establishment's reaction split almost immediately along interesting lines, and it's worth understanding both sides honestly rather than simply siding with hindsight against whichever position turned out to be more fashionable later. Richard Owen, the era's most prominent British anatomist, a man with genuine expertise and genuine standing, the same Owen who would go on to coin the word dinosaur only a few years later, wrote a widely circulated public rebuttal arguing that Maquet and his officers had almost certainly misidentified an ordinary, if unusually large, sea mammal, quite possibly an elongated seal, or a young whale swimming in an unusual posture. Its apparent size and speed distorted by the difficulty of accurately judging distance and scale on open water with no fixed reference point nearby. Owen's argument wasn't unreasonable on its face. Misjudged scale at sea genuinely was, and remains, a well-documented source of error. And Owen had legitimate anatomical grounds for doubting that any known serpentine animal could sustain the swimming posture Maquet described. Captain Maquet, for his part, did not take the public correction quietly, and his response, published in its own right in the following weeks, deserves attention for what it reveals about how seriously a professional naval officer of the period took his own credibility. He wrote back with precise, almost clinical specificity, rejecting Owen's seal theory point by point, the animal's head. He insisted, bore no resemblance whatsoever to a seal's rounded profile, its colour, a dark brownish black with a noticeably paler underside, matched nothing in Owen's proposed explanation, and critically, the creature had maintained its head and neck steadily above the water for the full 20 minutes of observation, a posture Maquet argued no known seal or whale species could physically sustain at that sustained a speed. It was, in essence, one trained naval observer's direct testimony set squarely against a respected anatomist's theoretical reconstruction from second-hand description, a genuine, unresolved scientific dispute playing out in real time across the pages of London's newspapers, with no laboratory specimen available to either side to settle the argument definitively. That's the detail worth sitting with here, because it's the same detail that runs through nearly every sea monster account this entire evening has touched on. The argument was never really about whether the witnesses were lying. Nobody seriously accused Maquet or his officers of fabrication, a captain's professional reputation in the Royal Navy of 1848, was worth considerably more than the fleeting notoriety of a monster sighting, and he had every incentive to simply say nothing at all if he weren't genuinely confident in what he'd seen. The argument was about interpretation, about what an honest, credible, trained observer's eyes could and couldn't reliably tell him at a distance, in open water, watching an unfamiliar animal moving fast past a moving ship. That gap between honest testimony and reliable identification is, in the end, the same gap that had produced 2 centuries of Kraken sightings, and it would go on producing sea monster reports for a good deal longer still. The Daedalus sighting wasn't isolated, and understanding the broader pattern it fit into helps explain why it landed with such force on the public imagination. New England had its own well-documented tradition of sea serpent sightings decades before Mackay's report, most famously a cluster of reports from Gloucester, Massachusetts in August of 1817, when dozens of separate witnesses, fishermen, merchants, a visiting delegation from the Linnaean Society of New England, sent specifically to investigate, reported observing a large, dark, serpentine creature in the harbour over the course of several days, consistent enough across independent accounts that the investigating naturalists took the reports seriously enough to publish a formal account of their own, despite never managing to capture or conclusively identify the animal themselves. The Gloucester sightings and the Daedalus sighting, 3 decades and an ocean apart, shared a curious set of consistent details: the serpentine profile, the head held above water, the reported speed. Details that later cryptozoological writers would spend considerable energy trying to connect into a single, unified sea serpent narrative, though serious modern scientists remain, appropriately, cautious about drawing too firm a line between geographically and temporally separated eyewitness accounts of this kind. Modern zoological hindsight, for what it's worth, offers a few candidate explanations worth mentioning honestly rather than dismissively, because they say something interesting about how much the ocean still had left to reveal even in an era that considered itself thoroughly rational. The oarfish, Regalicus glesni, are genuinely enormous, ribbon-shaped deep sea fish that can grow past 30 feet in length, with a distinctive crimson dorsal fin running the length of its body, wasn't formally well documented by Western science until well after 1848, and its rare surface appearances, usually associated with sick or dying individuals rising from deep water, have been proposed by more than one modern researcher as a plausible explanation for at least some historical sea serpent reports, the Daedalus sighting included. It's a compelling theory. It's also, honestly, not a perfect fit. The sustained 20-minute observation, the reported swimming speed, and the specific head and shoulders posture McQueerhay described don't map cleanly onto known oarfish behaviour, which tends towards slow, near vertical drifting rather than sustained fast-forward swimming. A large, unusually postured whale, perhaps a sei whale, a species not formally distinguished from closely related species until decades after the Daedalus sighting, remains another honestly plausible candidate, and it may simply be that no single explanation accounts for every detail Mackay and his officers swore to. What deserves to be said plainly, in the spirit of the honesty this whole evening has tried to hold on to, is this: the Daedalus sighting has never been definitively solved. Not by Owen in 1848, not by any of the several competing theories proposed in the century and 3/4 since. It remains, by the standards of any serious modern review of historical cryptozoological evidence, one of the best corroborated, most professionally documented sea monster sightings in the maritime record. 4 trained officers, a formal Admiralty report, a captain willing to stake his professional reputation on defending his account against one of Britain's most respected anatomists, and also, simultaneously, an account that cannot be conclusively matched to any single known species with full confidence. That combination, uncomfortable as it might be to a modern taste for tidy resolutions, is in some ways the most honest legacy the whole Kraken tradition ever produced, not proof of monsters, and not proof of nothing, but proof that the deep ocean, even watched by careful, credentialed, sceptical men with every professional incentive toward caution, kept right on producing things nobody could fully explain. The legacy of the Daedalus sighting rippled outward for the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th, feeding directly into what would eventually become the modern field of cryptozoology, the systematic, if often scientifically marginal, study of animals reported but not formally confirmed to exist. Later sea serpent researchers, most notably the Belgian-French zoologist Bernard Heuvelmans in the mid-20th century, would cite the Daedalus case repeatedly as a cornerstone example of credible, professionally documented testimony deserving more serious scientific attention than it typically received, arguing, much as Bishop Pontoppidan had argued 2 centuries earlier about the Kraken, that dismissing consistent, independently corroborated eyewitness testimony purely because it lacked a physical specimen said more about the limits of scientific method than about the honesty of the witnesses themselves. Whether Heuvelmans' broader project ever produced the kind of definitive vindication that eventually arrived for the giant squid remains, itself an open and contested question. But the pattern connecting Pontoppidan's fisherman to Macuihé's quarterdeck to Heuvelmans' later scholarship is difficult to miss. Every generation of the deep ocean skeptics has eventually had to reckon with how much of what it confidently dismissed turned out, on longer inspection, to have been more real than convenient to admit. There's a smaller, quieter detail buried in the Daedalus story that rarely makes it into the popular retellings, and it's worth pulling out here because it says something true about how differently the era's institutions handled uncertainty compared to how a modern newsroom might handle the same event today. The engraving published alongside Macuihé's account in the Illustrated London News wasn't drawn by the captain himself, despite being based on his sketch, and in the process of translating a rough field drawing into a polished, publishable illustration, the artist made choices about the creature's exact head shape, about how prominently its supposed mane or fin was rendered, that Macuié later felt overstated and dramatised details he hadn't intended to emphasise so strongly. He wrote a separate, quieter letter clarifying exactly this point, noting that the published image had taken certain liberties the original account didn't support. It's a small, almost bureaucratic correction, easy to miss among the louder public argument with Owen, but it matters, because it's a reminder that even the most carefully documented historical sea monster account passed through at least one layer of artistic interpretation before it ever reached the public. The same basic distortion that had, in a cruder form, been reshaping Kraken folklore for 2 centuries already, each retelling adding a little more certainty and a little more drama than the last one actually supported. The credibility question deserves a slightly longer look too, because it's easy from a modern vantage point to underestimate just how much weight a Royal Navy captain's professional word actually carried in 1848. And how much he personally had to lose by attaching his name to a claim this extraordinary. Naval officers of Macuihé's generation built entire careers on a reputation for sober, reliable judgment under pressure, the exact quality the Admiralty needed to trust when sending a man across an ocean with a warship and several dozen lives under his command. A captain known for exaggeration, for embellishment, for chasing a good story over an accurate one, simply did not advance through the ranks of the Victorian Royal Navy, and Macuihé's 27 years into his naval career by the time of the Daedalus voyage, had every professional reason to stay silent about an encounter this strange, rather than risk the ridicule that did in fact follow, that he chose to report it formally anyway, and chose to defend it publicly, in print, against one of the most respected scientific minds in the country, rather than simply letting the matter quietly drop, tells you something about how genuinely confident he was in what his own eyes had shown him, whatever that thing ultimately was. The Gloucester sightings of 1817 deserve a slightly fuller telling in their own right, because the investigation that followed them was, by the standards of the period, unusually rigorous, and it offers a useful point of comparison for how differently 2 respectable institutions handled remarkably similar evidence a generation apart. The Linnaean Society of New England's investigating committee didn't simply collect rumours second-hand. They interviewed witnesses directly, under something close to formal deposition, cross-checking descriptions against each other for consistency, and specifically noting where accounts diverged as well as where they agreed. Most witnesses described a creature between 50 and 100 feet in length, dark-coloured, moving in a distinctive vertical undulation rather than the side-to-side motion typical of fish and most marine mammals, a detail that would, decades later, become one of the more persistently debated specifics in the entire sea serpent literature, since true vertical undulation of that kind isn't mechanically consistent with any known large marine animal's actual skeletal structure. One local resident, a ship's carpenter with no particular reputation for tall tales, reported watching the creature from close enough range to describe what he took to be a row of humps breaking the surface as it moved, a detail some later investigators have proposed might actually describe several smaller marine animals, dolphins or porpoises perhaps, swimming in a tight line and misread collectively, at a distance, as a single enormous undulating body. It's a plausible, almost satisfying explanation. It also, notably, fails to account for the more detailed, closer-range testimony several other Gloucester witnesses gave describing an unmistakably single continuous creature rather than a group of smaller animals moving in formation. What connects Gloucester in 1817 to the Daedalus in 1848 isn't a shared species necessarily. The geography and behaviour described don't obviously match well enough to insist on it, but a shared pattern in how the surrounding culture chose to respond. In both cases, credible, multiply-corroborated eyewitness testimony collided directly with a scientific establishment structurally unable to accept a claim it couldn't examine physically, and in both cases, the resulting public argument generated far more heat than resolution. Neither case was ever formally solved to universal satisfaction. Neither witness group was ever proven to have lied or fundamentally erred. The animals, whatever they actually were, simply declined to surface again for anyone in a position to settle the question definitively, and the ocean characteristically kept its answer to itself. There's a final irony worth noting before this chapter closes. Quay himself likely never appreciated during his lifetime. He died in 1885, 37 years after the sighting, his career otherwise entirely ordinary and largely undistinguished by any measure the Royal Navy cared about. A competent, reliable officer who commanded several more ships without incident and retired eventually to a quiet life ashore. And yet the single thing his name is remembered for today, the entry that survives him in nearly every serious history of maritime cryptozoology written in the century and a half since, isn't a battle or a promotion or a long career of faithful service. It's 20 minutes on an ordinary afternoon watch, an animal he couldn't identify, and the simple, stubborn decision to write down exactly what he saw rather than quietly deciding, as it would certainly have been easier to do, that he must have been mistaken and the whole thing best left unreported. There's something worth sitting within that, something almost tender about it, an entire career of honest, competent, forgettable service, and then one afternoon of honest, careful witness to something extraordinary, and it's the 20 minutes, not the 37 years, that history chose to keep. That unresolved quality is, in its own strange way, the most honest note this chapter can end on, and it sets up something worth carrying forward into everything that follows tonight. For every documented case like the giant squid, eventually settled by a hatchet, a photograph, and 70 years of accumulating physical evidence, there remain cases like the Daedalus and like Gloucester, where the testimony was every bit as careful and every bit as credible, and where the ocean simply never obliged anyone with a specimen. Sailors of every era learned to hold both possibilities at once, the settled and the unsettled, the proven and the merely, stubbornly plausible. And it's that same dual habit of mind, carried forward through generations of maritime superstition, that shaped nearly every ritual a pirate crew ever practiced to keep itself steady on open water. It's worth remembering, too, that Mackay and his officers were naval men, not pirates, sailing under a flag and a chain of command that owed the Admiralty a formal report the moment land was next sighted. Pirate crews had no equivalent obligation, no Admiralty waiting to receive their testimony. No newspaper eager to publish their sketch of whatever they'd seen on a moonless watch somewhere off the Windward Passage. Whatever an outlawed crew encountered in open water simply became part of the ship's own private lore, passed hand to hand in the same way Ambrose Dell had once passed along the story of the rail touch and the whistling ban, unrecorded, unverified, and for exactly that reason. In some ways even more powerful a shaping force on how those men actually lived their working lives day to day, month after month, watch after watch, for however many years the trade allowed a man to survive it. A pirate captain would never write to the Admiralty about a strange shape glimpsed off the bow at dusk, and no illustrated London news artist would ever sketch it for a paying public. But the fear itself travelled anyway, ship to ship, tavern to tavern, exactly as thoroughly as if it had been formally published, carried not by ink, but by the same quiet, disciplined habits Corwin Ash had spent 2 decades accumulating, and was about to spend a good deal of this particular voyage patiently teaching to somebody new. The tattoo needle is nothing more than a sailmaker's needle bound to a stick, dipped in a mixture of gunpowder and whatever ink can be scavenged aboard, and it hurts considerably more than anyone tells you beforehand. You're getting your first one 3 months into your time under articles, sitting on an overturned barrel, while the ship's oldest hand works the design into the inside of your forearm with the patient, unhurried concentration of a man who's done this dozens of times before and lost count of exactly how many. His name is Corwin Ash, and he's been sailing under one set of pirate articles or another for the better part of 22 years, a fact he mentions not with any particular pride, but simply as a statement of arithmetic, the way another man might mention his age. He walks with a peg below the left knee, replaced twice in his career as the wood wore down, lost, as he tells it, with more humour than the subject probably deserves, to a chain shot during a fight off Hispaniola a decade back, the wound serious enough that the ship's surgeon of the time had taken the leg below the knee to save the rest of him. The articles paid him for it. 600 pieces of 8 drawn from the ship's common stock before any other man's share was divided, exactly as written. Exactly as every man aboard, including you, had signed his own name to agreeing would happen if the same misfortune ever found him instead. Here's the thing about a ship's superstitions that Corwin explains to you patiently, needle still moving. While he works, they're not really about believing in monsters. Not most of them, not even the ones that sound like they are. They're about discipline, dressed up in a costume elaborate enough that a tired, frightened, homesick crew will actually keep following the rules without needing to be threatened into it every single time. Take the business of the word itself, the one nobody aboard says out loud, ever, not even in jest, not even describing something that happened to another ship entirely. You don't say a man drowned, you say he went over, or that the sea took him, or, if the mood calls for something gentler, that he's gone to swim with Davy Jones. Corwin tells you this isn't really superstition in the sense of magical thinking at all. It's closer to what a modern listener might recognise as simple emotional self-preservation, a crew collectively agreeing not to say the specific word that makes the specific fear too real to keep working around. Say it plainly often enough, the old logic goes, and you invite the sea to prove the word's meaning to you personally. Corwin doesn't fully believe that part, he admits, but he's never once tested it either, and neither, in his experience, has any other sailor he's known. By the time your first tattoo is finished, an anchor, the plainest and most common design any new hand aboard typically chooses, simple enough that even Corwin's unsteady hand can't ruin it, he tells you what it's meant to do, beyond simply marking you as a man who's crossed real open water. An anchor, in the sailor's private symbolic language, passed down through generations of maritime superstition, represents stability, a promise, worn permanently on the skin, that no matter how far a man drifts, something will eventually hold him fast to solid ground again. It's not really about warding off any specific monster, it's about carrying, physically, a small piece of the hope that this particular voyage, and every voyage after it, eventually ends somewhere safe. 3 weeks after your tattoo heals, the ship crosses into waters Corwin refers to only as the old grounds. a stretch of deep Atlantic current well east of the usual Caribbean trade routes, waters he's crossed perhaps a dozen times in his career and treats, every single time, with a specific and unvarying ritual, a small offering thrown from the bow rather than the stern. Timed to the exact moment the ship's position, judged by dead reckoning, crosses what he believes to be the boundary of unusually deep water. It's not the same offering ritual you learned during the becalmed voyage months earlier. Cudjoe's version was about appeasing a general ambient danger. Corwin's is more specific, more personal, tied to a single stretch of ocean he's simply decided, over 2 decades of crossing it, deserves particular respect. When you ask him directly why this water and not any other, he shrugs and admits he genuinely doesn't know anymore, only that an older hand taught him the practice on his very first voyage, on this very stretch of water, and that he's never once crossed it without observing the ritual since, and never once regretted the small cost of doing so. The ship's cat deserves its own mention here, if only because the superstition surrounding her is one of the few aboard that every single hand, from the captain down to the newest pressed man, takes with total and unquestioning seriousness. Her name is Marigold, black with a single white paw, adopted from a Nassau dockside litter 2 captains before the current one, and inherited, along with the ship itself, through at least one change of command. Killing a ship's cat, even by accident, is held aboard this vessel, as aboard most vessels of the era, this particular belief being one of the most widely and consistently documented pieces of maritime folklore across the whole Atlantic world, to invite catastrophic bad luck, storms specifically, the kind severe enough to threaten the whole ship rather than merely inconvenience it. Marigold, for her part, seems entirely unaware of the metaphysical weight she carries, spending most of her days asleep in whatever patch of sun the deck offers, and most of her nights hunting the rats that would otherwise ravage the ship's stores. A practical benefit substantial enough on its own that the superstition, whatever its deeper origins, would probably have survived purely on economic grounds even without the added weight of bad luck folklore behind it. By the middle of your 2nd year under Articles, you've learned enough of Corwin's accumulated habits that you've started, almost without noticing, adopting several as your own, not out of full conviction exactly, but out of the same accumulated respect that had settled over you during your first year's night watches. You don't whistle after dark. You touch the rail. You never say the word Corwin taught you never to say. And you've started, in quiet moments, considering what design your second tattoo might be. Once you've earned, in whatever sense a man earns such things, the right to choose something more personal than a plain anchor. The storm arrives in your 2nd autumn under Articles, off the northern edge of the Bahamas, and it arrives with enough warning that the crew has time to properly prepare. Sails reefed early, loose cargo lashed down, every hand aboard given a specific task well before the first real gust hits. This is, Corwin points out to you as the sky darkens, exactly the kind of danger the ship's superstitions were never really meant to address. Because a storm this size announces itself hours in advance to anyone paying proper attention to the sky and the swell, leaving nothing much for ritual to do that good seamanship hasn't already covered. What the superstitions had spent 2 years training into you, though, turns out to matter anyway, in a sideways sort of way, the same discipline that kept you touching the rail every dark watch, the same habit of taking small, unprovable precautions seriously because the men around you took them seriously, is the same discipline that has you checking your lashings twice without being told. The same discipline that has the whole crew moving through the storm's chaos with a coordinated calm that owes as much to 2 years of shared ritual as to any single officer's shouted orders. Corwin's peg leg, of all things, very nearly costs him everything during the worst of it. A heavy sea catching the ship broadside, throwing every man on deck off balance at once, and Corwin, with less to brace against than a man with 2 full legs, goes down hard against the rail, close enough to going over entirely that you're the one who grabs his collar and hauls him back before the next wave. Clears the deck. Neither of you says much about it afterward. That's how the important things get handled aboard a ship like this, the same as it had been the night you'd promised Nathaniel, months and a different voyage ago, that you'd see his death done properly if it ever came to that. Corwin simply nods once, the way men who've spent their whole working lives at sea nod when a debt has been quietly incurred and quietly, wordlessly acknowledged, and goes back to his post. The storm breaks by the following dawn, the ship battered but whole, every hand accounted for, and Corwin, first thing, before even checking the state of the rigging, makes his way to the bow and throws a full ration of the crew's precious rum directly into the churning water, a gesture more extravagant than anything you've watched him do before, extravagant enough that another hand actually protests the waste out loud. Corwin doesn't argue the point. He simply says quietly that some debts are worth paying properly, and goes back to his work, leaving you to wonder, the way you'd wonder about a dozen other small rituals across 2 years aboard, whether he meant the sea, or meant something considerably closer to home, and understanding, somehow without needing to ask, that the answer was probably both at once. There's a piece of shipboard ritual that has nothing to do with monsters at all, and everything to do with the flag flying above your heads, and Corwin insists correctly as far as the historical record actually supports, that understanding it properly matters more to your survival than any superstition about whistling ever could. The black flag, the one popularly remembered today simply as the Jolly Roger, wasn't a single fixed design flown identically by every pirate crew of the era. It varied considerably from captain to captain, some featuring the familiar skull and crossed bones, others incorporating hourglasses, full skeletons, or bleeding hearts, each variation carrying slightly different local meaning depending on which waters and which reputation a given captain had built. What mattered practically, aboard nearly every pirate vessel of the period, was the difference between the black flag and the red one. Black, flown as a ship closed for a fight, was a genuine offer. Strike your colours now, surrender without a real fight. And the crew taken would very likely be given quarter, spared, robbed of cargo certainly, but spared. Red, flown considerably more rarely and reserved for crews who had already refused reasonable terms, or who had a specific grievance against the vessel in question, meant no quarter would be given at all. Corwin tells you this isn't superstition, exactly. But it functions the same way in practice, a piece of shared ritualized communication that every experienced sailor on either side of the law understood instantly, without needing a single word exchanged. And that had directly saved more lives, pirate and victim alike, than any charm or tattoo aboard this ship ever had. The matter of seabirds gets more genuinely superstitious, and Corwin is characteristically honest about the fact that this particular belief has never once been tested to his satisfaction, only inherited. Certain birds, spotted far from any land, considered by experienced sailors to be carrying, in some unspoken way, the souls of drowned sailors. Returned to keep watch over living crews still working the same waters where they were lost, are treated with a specific, careful respect, never harmed, never even startled deliberately, and their appearance near a ship in distress is taken as something closer to comfort than omen, proof that the ocean, whatever it eventually claims, doesn't claim entirely without leaving something behind to look after the living. It's a gentler superstition than most of the ones governing this ship's routine, and Corwin admits, quietly, that he's never quite been able to decide whether he actually believes it, or simply finds it too comforting a thought to risk testing by treating a lost bird carelessly. The old belief about women aboard ship is one Corwin discusses more carefully than the others, and it's worth understanding honestly rather than repeating uncritically, because the historical record on this particular superstition is considerably messier than popular retellings usually admit. The common version, that a woman's presence aboard a ship invited bad luck, storms specifically. The sea's jealousy provoked by a rival presence was genuinely held by a great many sailors of the period, and Corwin doesn't pretend otherwise. But he's also quick to point out what every honest maritime historian eventually has to acknowledge: the belief coexisted, often within the very same crews, with a long and well-documented record of women who sailed anyway, some disguised as men for years at a stretch without detection, others sailing openly under articles that made no formal distinction at all between a man's share and a woman's, so long as she could pull her weight the same as any hand aboard. The superstition, in other words, was real, widely held, and simultaneously never quite strong enough to actually keep women off pirate decks in practice. A contradiction Corwin shrugs off with the same weary practicality he applies to most of the ship's inherited beliefs. Sailors, he tells you, have always been perfectly capable of holding two contradictory ideas at once, so long as both of them gave a frightened man something to blame besides his own bad luck. By the time your third year under Articles arrives, you understand something about all of this that took the full 2 years prior to properly settle into you. None of these rituals, not the tattoos, not the flag conventions, not the careful treatment of a lost bird far from land, were ever really about controlling the ocean itself. The ocean, as every hand aboard this ship understood better than almost anyone working a trade ashore, could not be controlled, bargained with, or reliably predicted by any means available to a wooden ship and a compass. What the rituals actually controlled was considerably more modest and, in its own way, considerably more valuable. They controlled the crew. A frightened man with a specific, small, achievable task, touch the rail, don't whistle, throw the offering at the right moment, is a steadier man than a frightened man, with nothing at all to do except sit with his fear directly. Corwin had learned that lesson across 2 decades at sea, the same way generations of sailors before him had learned it, and he'd spent a good portion of your first 2 years aboard quietly, patiently teaching you the same thing, one small ritual at a time, without ever once explicitly naming what he was actually doing. That's the inheritance Corwin eventually hands you, not as a single lesson delivered all at once, but accumulated across dozens of small moments the way most real education actually happens. A fear of the deep water, yes, the same fear that had sent Norwegian fishermen fleeing at the first whiff of a certain smell, and had kept a Royal Navy captain's testimony debated in London newspapers for months. But alongside that fear, and doing at least as much work in keeping a crew alive across a working lifetime at sea, a whole quiet architecture of habit and ritual and shared, unprovable belief. Not because any of it could stop a genuine monster, if one existed at all, but because it had, across 2 centuries of practice, reliably stopped something considerably more common and considerably more dangerous, a frightened crew from coming apart at exactly the moment it most needed to hold together. There's one final ritual worth mentioning before this particular thread closes, because it's the one Corwin treats most seriously of all despite being, on its face, the most ordinary. Every man aboard, upon first signing the ship's articles, is asked, not required by any written clause, simply asked, quietly, by whichever senior hand happens to witness the signing, to name one person ashore who should receive word, and whatever share is owed should the worst happen. It isn't romantic. It isn't dressed up in any of the ship's usual superstitious language. It's simply a practical acknowledgement, built directly into the culture surrounding the articles themselves, that every man aboard has somewhere he came from and someone who'll want to know what became of him. Corwin's own name, given decades ago on some now forgotten ship, belonged to a sister in Bristol he hasn't seen in 19 years, and still, he tells you, updates faithfully every time he signs a fresh set of articles under a new captain, just in case this voyage turns out to be the one where the name finally gets used. You give your own name that same season to a person you've mentioned to nobody else aboard, and you find, once it's done, that the small act of saying it out loud settles something in your chest that no rail touch or thrown offering ever quite managed to. It's a strange thing to realise, sitting afterward with the taste of the moment still fresh, that the most powerful ritual aboard this whole ship, more powerful than any tattoo or any careful treatment of a lost seabird, was simply this: the plain, deliberate act of making sure you wouldn't be forgotten, spoken aloud once and then carried quietly by whoever heard it, for as long as the voyage, and the years after it, allowed Corwin, watching you do it, says nothing at all. Just claps you once on the shoulder, the way he might mark the end of any ordinary piece of work, and turns back to whatever needed doing next, leaving you to sit a while longer with the strange steadying weight of having finally said the thing out loud. You think, in that quiet moment, about how differently this whole architecture of ritual would look to someone watching from outside it, a naval officer, say, or a naturalist back in London, entirely unaware of how deliberately each small habit had been built, generation by generation, to hold a crew together rather than to hold any actual sea monster at bay. From outside, it would look like simple credulity, grown men refusing to whistle, touching a rail, choosing a tattoo design for reasons half of them couldn't fully explain even to themselves. From inside it, sitting where you're sitting now, it looks like something closer to a language, one built slowly, out of necessity, by people who had no other reliable tool for managing a fear that could never be fully reasoned away, and who found, across 2 centuries of trial and accumulated habit, that a shared ritual did something a shared argument never could. It didn't answer the fear, it simply gave the fear somewhere useful to go, somewhere out past the edge of every chart this ship had ever carried. Other crews, naval crews, this time with rather more scientific curiosity than superstition to guide them, were about to test that same fear against something considerably more concrete than a rail touch or a thrown offering, an actual living creature surfacing directly alongside a warship, close enough to harpoon. November 30th, 1861. Open water off the coast of Tenerife, in the Canary Islands. The French naval steamer Alecton, under the command of Lieutenant Commander Frederic Marie Bouillet, running a routine survey patrol under a clear afternoon sky when the lookout calls out something none of the crew's training had adequately prepared them for. A vast reddish mass, floating at the surface roughly a mile off the ship's bow, at first mistaken, the way these things so often were, for a half-submerged wreck or a mat of drifting seaweed. Bouillet altered course to investigate. The mass, as the Alecton closed the distance, resolved itself into something considerably more alive than driftwood, an enormous cephalopod, its main body alone estimated by the crew at somewhere between 15 and 18 feet, arms trailing considerably further, moving with a slow, undulating rhythm across the surface swell. Here's what happened next, and it's worth telling plainly because the actual sequence of events matters more to the eventual scientific credibility of the encounter than any embellishment could add to it. Bouillet, recognizing immediately that he was looking at exactly the kind of animal European naturalists had spent the better part of a century arguing over the existence of, made the decision to attempt something no ship's crew had seriously tried before, capturing it, alive if possible, dead if necessary, as physical proof. This is the story of the Alecton's battle. Not a battle in any sense the ship's crew would have recognized from actual naval combat, but a genuine, sustained 3-hour struggle between a French warship's crew and a single enormous animal, fought with harpoons, rifle fire, and finally a length of rope, and ending in a result that satisfied almost nobody involved, and yet changed the scientific argument permanently regardless. The crew's first attempts were, by Bouillet's own later account, almost comically unsuccessful. Harpoons thrown from the deck either failed to penetrate the animal's soft gelatinous flesh deeply enough to hold, or tore straight through it on impact, doing considerable damage without providing any way to actually secure the creature or draw it closer to the ship. Rifle fire proved similarly disappointing. Shots that would have dropped nearly any vertebrate animal of comparable size seemed to do remarkably little to slow the creature down, a detail that puzzled the crew at the time and that modern marine biology would later explain easily enough. A cephalopod's soft-bodied anatomy, lacking the vital. Concentrated organ structures a rifle ball reliably disrupts in a mammal, simply absorbed the damage across its bulk without any single shot proving immediately incapacitating. By the second hour of the engagement, with harpoons failing and gunfire proving ineffective, Bouillet ordered his crew to attempt something more direct, a running noose, fashioned from ship's rope, worked carefully around the animal's body in hopes of securing it well enough to haul aboard, or at minimum, well enough to tow back to port, as undeniable physical proof of the encounter. The crew managed, after considerable difficulty, to get the noose around what they took to be the animal's tail section, and began hauling. What happened next is the detail that every serious retelling of this story eventually has to sit with honestly, because it's simultaneously the moment of the crew's greatest tactical success and the moment their prize was almost entirely lost. As the crew hauled on the rope, the animal's own weight and the strain of the tightening noose caused its body to tear apart at the point of greatest tension, the soft tissue simply unable to withstand the combined force of its own bulk and the ship's mechanical advantage. The main body of the creature, along with most of its arms, broke free and sank beneath the surface, disappearing into water too deep for any recovery. What remained in the crew's grasp, hauled finally onto the Electon's deck after 3 hours of struggle, was a single section of the tail, by most later accounts weighing somewhere in the neighbourhood of 40 pounds, a fraction of the animal's original mass, but a fraction considerably more substantial than anything European science had directly possessed up to that point. Bouyer, to his considerable credit as an observer even in the immediate aftermath of what must have been an exhausting and only partially successful engagement, didn't simply preserve the specimen and move on. He commissioned a detailed sketch of the encounter from one of his officers, recording the animal's approximate proportions, coloration, and behaviour as precisely as memory and the chaos of a 3-hour struggle allowed, and he prepared a formal written report intended specifically for submission to the French Academy of Sciences, following, whether he consciously modelled it or not, almost exactly the same instinct that had driven Captain McQuay to formally report his own encounter to the Admiralty 13 years earlier. A naval officer, confronted with something extraordinary and largely unbelievable, reaching immediately for the most credible, most institutional channel available to make sure the encounter wasn't simply lost to rumour and exaggeration. The Academy's reception, when Bouyer's report and specimen finally reached Paris, was every bit as sceptical as the reception Captain McQuay had faced, and in some ways more pointed, because the scientific stakes had risen considerably in the years since the Daedalus sighting. Pierre Denis de Montfort's disgrace 6 decades earlier still cast a long shadow over any serious scientific discussion of giant cephalopods, and several prominent members of the Academy were openly, publicly dismissive of Bouyer's account, suggesting the naval officer had either badly exaggerated an encounter with a considerably more mundane animal, or had simply been taken in by his own crew's excitement in the heat of an unusual engagement. One critic, according to accounts of the period, went so far as to suggest publicly that the whole affair belonged more properly in a work of fiction than in a scientific proceeding. A stinging dismissal for a career naval officer who had, by every reasonable measure, behaved with considerably more caution and documentation than the sensational claim might have warranted. What ultimately saved Bouyer's reputation and secured the Electon encounter's lasting place in the scientific record wasn't any single piece of evidence he personally produced. It was time, and Newfoundland, and the sheer accumulating weight of independent corroboration that arrived over the following decade. When Theophilus Pickett and Daniel Squires brought their 19-foot severed arm ashore 12 years later, and when the Reverend Moses Harvey's photograph made its way around the same scientific circles that had mocked Bouyer's report, the Electon's 40-pound tail section, preserved still in the collection where Bouyer had deposited it, suddenly stopped looking like an isolated naval officer's exaggeration and started looking like exactly what it had always been, an early, genuine, if incomplete, piece of physical evidence for a real and previously uncatalogued animal. Later naturalists, reviewing the case with the benefit of accumulated Newfoundland evidence, would go so far as to credit the Electon encounter as the first documented instance of a giant squid being directly engaged, injured, and partially recovered by human beings, not merely stranded on a beach after death, but actively encountered, alive, in open water, by trained observers who fought for 3 hours to bring proof of it home. There's a particular kind of vindication in that timeline worth pausing on, because it mirrors almost exactly the Archbishop Pontoppidan's testimony had followed a full century earlier. Bouyer's crew fought an actual living giant squid, documented as carefully as the chaos of the encounter allowed, and were mocked for their trouble by the very scientific institution best positioned to take them seriously. It took 12 more years and considerably more physical evidence than any single ship could reasonably have been expected to provide. Before the scientific consensus finally caught up to what a French naval crew had already learnt the hard way, 3 exhausting hours at a time, off the coast of Tenerife. The specific tactical lessons of the Electon engagement, meanwhile, quietly reshaped how the small number of subsequent attempts to study living giant squid were approached for decades afterward, even as those attempts remained vanishingly rare given how difficult the animal proved to locate reliably at all. The lesson about rope and rifle fire proving poorly suited to a soft-bodied deep-water animal wasn't lost on later naturalists. It fed directly into growing scientific understanding of cephalopod anatomy more broadly, reinforcing what Steenstrup's careful beak analysis had already suggested about how fundamentally different these animals were from the vertebrate sea creatures most naval encounters up to that point had actually involved. In a strange, roundabout way, the Electon's failure to capture its prize intact ended up contributing nearly as much to eventual scientific understanding as a clean, successful capture might have, a reminder that even an incomplete victory, honestly documented and stubbornly defended, could move an entire field of science forward one skeptical decade at a time. It's worth stepping back into the 3 hours of the actual engagement itself, because the official report and the eventual scientific vindication tend to flatten what must have been, for the ordinary sailors actually working the deck that afternoon, an almost unbearably strange and exhausting experience. Among the Electon's crew that day was a young ensign, barely into his 20s, whose name survives in secondary accounts of the incident only as Durette, assigned along with several other junior officers to the harpoon lines during the engagement's opening hour. Durette would later describe, in a letter home that a family member apparently preserved for some years afterward, the specific horror of watching a harpoon strike the animal's flesh and simply vanish into it without resistance, the creature's body absorbing the blow the way a heavy curtain might absorb a thrown stone, no blood in the way a wounded whale or shark would have produced, no visible reaction beyond a slow, almost thoughtful withdrawal of the wounded section away from the ship. It unsettled him more, he apparently wrote, than any enemy combatant he'd faced in more conventional naval service, precisely because the animal never behaved the way anything he'd fought before had behaved. No aggression, no clear attempt to fight back or flee decisively. Just a vast, patient, almost incomprehensible presence that seemed, if anything, mildly inconvenienced by 3 hours of a warship's concentrated effort to kill or capture it. That detail, the animal's apparent equanimity in the face of sustained assault, deserves a moment of genuine wonder rather than simply grim recounting, because it points towards something modern science would only later confirm about how differently a creature like this experiences danger compared to the vertebrate animals human sailors had spent centuries learning to fight, flee from, or hunt. A cephalopod's nervous system, distributed rather than centralized, processes pain and threat in ways still not fully understood even by contemporary marine biologists, whatever the giant squid off Tenerife actually experienced during those 3 hours. It almost certainly wasn't the same panicked, adrenaline-driven fight-or-flight response a wounded mammal would have shown. And the crew's own confusion at its seemingly unbothered demeanour was in its own way an accurate early glimpse into just how alien this animal's entire biology actually was compared to anything else they'd ever hunted or fought at sea. Boyer himself, in the more personal sections of his report that didn't make it into the formal Academy submission, apparently expressed something close to regret over the encounter's outcome, not regret at having attempted the capture, which he continued to defend as scientifically justified, but a quieter, more complicated regret at the animal's suffering. However alien that suffering might have looked to human eyes, it's a small, easily overlooked detail in a story more often remembered for its scientific consequences than its emotional ones, but it's worth sitting with. A career naval officer, hardened by years of more conventional and considerably bloodier service, finding something in this particular 3-hour engagement worth privately mourning, even as he understood perfectly well why the encounter had needed to happen the way it did. The sketch commissioned that afternoon deserves its own closer look too, because, much like the Illustrated London News engraving of Macquay's serpent 13 years earlier, it played a role in shaping public perception considerably larger than its modest origins as a single officer's field drawing might suggest. Copies of the sketch, reproduced in various popular science publications across France and eventually England over the following years, became one of the era's most widely recognised images of a sea monster, predating by more than a decade the more scientifically rigorous illustrations Addison Verrill would eventually produce from actual Newfoundland specimens. Generations of readers who never saw the Reverend Moses Harvey's careful photograph encountered the Electon's giant squid first, through an artist's necessarily imperfect rendering of 3 hours of chaotic struggle. And that image, dramatic, slightly exaggerated in exactly the ways field sketches under duress tend to be, did as much to fix the animal in the public imagination as any of the more careful scientific documentation that eventually followed it. There's a dry irony worth allowing itself a small joke here, one that Bouiller's own later writing seems to have half noticed himself, a warship, built and crewed specifically for the purpose of projecting French naval power across contested waters, had spent 3 hours and a considerable quantity of ammunition failing to subdue a single soft-bodied invertebrate, ultimately managing to bring home only 40 pounds of tail for its trouble. It's the kind of outcome that, framed differently, might have made the Electon's crew the subject of considerable good-natured mockery back in port. The mighty warship. Bested not by an enemy fleet, but by an animal with no bones, no visible aggression, and apparently very little interest in the fight being forced on it. Bouiller, to his credit, never seems to have taken the episode as a wound to his professional pride so much as a genuinely fascinating scientific puzzle, which likely did more than anything else to preserve his credibility once the Newfoundland evidence eventually arrived to support him. The scientific instruments available to Bouiller's crew that afternoon, harpoons, rifles, ordinary ship's rope, the accumulated hunting technology of centuries of whaling and naval combat, stand in almost comic contrast to what would eventually prove necessary to study this same species successfully in its own natural habitat, not force at all as it turned out, but patience, darkness, and technology, specifically designed not to provoke a reaction from an animal that had spent its entire evolutionary history avoiding exactly the kind of large, bioluminescent predator a research vessel's lights would otherwise resemble. Bouiller's own career, in the years following the encounter, followed a quieter arc than the drama of that single afternoon might suggest, and it's worth telling briefly because it echoes once again the same pattern this evening keeps returning to. He continued serving in the French Navy for years afterward, rising steadily through conventional ranks, and while the Electon encounter followed him for the rest of his career, mentioned, inevitably, in nearly every account written of him afterward, he never seems to have leaned into it for personal fame the way a less careful man might have. He simply kept the specimen properly documented, kept his report on file exactly where the Academy could revisit it once better evidence eventually arrived, and let the passage of time and the honest accumulation of independent proof do the vindicating rather than pursuing it himself. There's a particular kind of quiet dignity in that choice, the same dignity Captain Macquay had shown defending his own sighting years earlier, not chasing vindication, but simply refusing to recant an honest account under social pressure, and trusting that the truth given enough time tends to surface on its own. The 40 pounds of recovered tail, meanwhile, outlived nearly everyone directly involved in that afternoon's struggle. Preserved in the collections it was eventually deposited into, examined and re-examined by successive generations of naturalists as the broader scientific understanding of Architeuthis deepened through the following century, it remains to this day. One of the earliest verified physical specimens of the species ever recovered from a living, actively observed animal rather than a beach-stranded carcass. A small, battered, hard-won piece of proof, dragged aboard after 3 exhausting hours by a crew who had no way of knowing, in the moment, that history would eventually side entirely with them, and who went back to their ordinary naval duties the following morning as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all, because for a working ship's crew, That was, in the end, exactly what the job required of them. There would be no parade for what they'd done, no formal commendation beyond a line or two in a report most of them would never personally read. There would only be the specimen, quietly filed, quietly waiting for the rest of the world to catch up to what 3 exhausting hours off Tenerife had already, unmistakably, proven true. News of the encounter travelled through the world's ports considerably faster than the scientific argument over it ever resolved, and it's worth remembering that sailors of every stripe, naval officers, merchant crews and the last scattered remnants of the age of piracy alike, since privateering and outright piracy in the Atlantic world hadn't entirely vanished by 1861, only diminished, read newspaper accounts of the Electon's battle with a very different reaction than the sceptical academics in Paris. To a working sailor, the story needed no defending at all. Of course, a warship had struggled for 3 hours against something enormous in open water, and come away with only a fraction of it to show. That was, in broad strokes, roughly what generations of maritime folklore had been insisting was possible the entire time. The only genuinely surprising part, to men who'd spent careers half believing in Pontoppidan's Kraken, was that a modern steam-powered warship, bristling with rifles and harpoons, had fared only marginally better against the animal than an 18th century Norwegian fishing boat armed with nothing but oars and a head start. There's a dry, almost affectionate irony worth noting in that comparison, one that would likely have amused Ambrose Dell or Corwin Ashe considerably more than it amused the French Academy of Sciences. For all the accumulated technological advantage of a century's worth of naval progress, all that separated the modern warship's outcome from the humble fishing boats was roughly 1 extra hour of struggle and 40 pounds of recovered tissue. The ocean, it turned out, remained remarkably unimpressed by rifles, and considerably less impressed still by the wounded pride of the men who had carried them. That realization, that violence, was in the end the wrong tool entirely for finally solving the mystery Boyer's crew had fought so hard to advance. Wouldn't fully arrive for another century and a half, and it would take a rather different kind of expedition, one built around cameras and patience rather than harpoons and rope, to finally succeed where 3 hours of determined French naval effort had ultimately, if instructively, fallen short. The hum of the generator is the first thing you notice aboard the research vessel. A low, constant vibration running through the deck plates that you'll stop consciously hearing within about 3 days, and that will, strangely, be the thing you miss most once the expedition finally ends. You're part of the technical support crew for a joint scientific expedition in the summer of 2012, working out of the waters near the Ogasawara Islands, roughly 600 miles south of Tokyo. And the job in front of you, stated plainly in every briefing since you signed on, is one that has defeated every serious attempt made at it for the better part of a century and a half. Film a living giant squid in its own natural habitat, undisturbed and unharmed. Here's what nobody tells you clearly before you sign on. The actual work is almost entirely waiting. Not the dramatic, tension-filled waiting of a storm bearing down or a becalmed ship rationing its last casks of water, but a quieter, more technical kind of waiting, checking battery levels, recalibrating camera housings. Running the same equipment checks for the 4th or 5th consecutive day with nothing whatsoever to show for it, in water so deep that sunlight hasn't meaningfully penetrated it since a point roughly 200 meters above wherever your equipment currently sits. The lead scientist directing the underwater search is Dr. Tsunemi Kubadera, a marine biologist who has spent decades of his career pursuing exactly this goal. Following leads other researchers had long since abandoned as impractical, squid beaks recovered from whale stomachs, torn fishing nets bearing telltale sucker marks, the accumulated fragmentary evidence of an animal that had, by this point in scientific history, been proven beyond doubt to exist, and yet had never once been reliably filmed alive, moving, hunting, behaving as itself rather than as a specimen already dying or dead. Working alongside the expedition is Dr. Edith Widder, an American marine biologist and bioluminescence specialist whose own contribution to this particular hunt turns out to matter as much as anything else aboard, a camera and lure system of her own design, one built specifically around a single elegant insight that decades of previous failed attempts had somehow missed. The insight, once it's explained to you properly by one of the technicians managing the system day to day, a patient, precise young engineer named Mei Tanaka, who maintains the equipment with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for something considerably more expensive than it actually is, turns out to be almost embarrassingly simple in hindsight. Every previous serious attempt to film a giant squid at depth had relied on bright white submersible lights, the same kind of lighting that had made deep-sea exploration possible in the first place, and every one of those attempts had come back empty, decade after decade, expedition after expedition. Widder's theory, developed from years of separate research into how deep-sea animals actually perceive and react to light, was that the bright white lights themselves were the entire problem. That any animal which had spent its whole evolutionary history in near-total darkness, its enormous eyes built specifically to detect the faintest hint of bioluminescent movement, would treat a submersible's floodlights not as illumination but as a blaring alarm, driving it away from the exact area researchers were trying to observe long before any camera ever had the chance to find it. Her solution, deployed on this expedition for the first time in this particular combination, used red light instead, a wavelength invisible to most deep-sea animals, whose eyes have evolved specifically to detect the blue-green spectrum dominant at depth, allowing the camera system to record without announcing its own presence the way white light inevitably had. Paired with the red light camera was something called the E-jelly, an electronic lure designed by Widder to mimic, with unsettling precision, the specific bioluminescent distress display of the atoller jellyfish, a deep-sea species known to produce a distinctive pinwheeling flash of light when attacked, a display some researchers had theorized functioned less as a defense in itself and more as a kind of alarm call, summoning larger predators to attack whatever was currently attacking the jellyfish, in the hope that the resulting chaos might offer the jellyfish itself a chance to escape. If a giant squid was among the larger predators drawn to that signal, Widder reasoned, then an artificial version of the same distress display, deployed patiently and repeatedly across enough hours of deep water, might finally succeed where a century and a half of brute force searching had failed. By your third week aboard, the routine has settled into something close to monastic discipline. Dawn briefings, equipment checks, the submersible's descent to depths beyond 600 meters, hours of recorded footage reviewed afterward frame by frame for anything beyond ordinary deep-sea fauna, and, night after night, nothing, the crew's mood by this point, has stopped being anxious and settled instead into a kind of grim professional patience, the same discipline you'd recognise instantly from Cudjoe's steady rationing during a dead calm 2 centuries earlier, though nobody aboard this modern vessel would likely think to draw the comparison themselves. By dive 29, a number the whole crew has started tracking with the particular grim humour of people watching a losing streak extend well past the point of comfort. Dr. Kubadera makes the decision, against some resistance from crew members exhausted by weeks of fruitless submersible dives, to try something different, piloting the submersible himself, alongside the pilot. Down to a depth of roughly 630 metres, well below the range most of the expedition's previous attempts had focused on, patient enough to sit motionless at depth for hours at a stretch rather than actively searching, letting Widder's lure do the work rather than the submersible's own limited mobility. Here's the moment, when it finally comes, and it's worth telling exactly as the crew who lived through it describe it afterward, because no embellishment this evening could improve on how genuinely astonishing the plain facts already are. On July 10th, 2012, at a depth of roughly 630 metres, drawn in by Widder's patient, pulsing electronic lure, a living giant squid appeared in the submersible's red light camera frame. Not a carcass, not a fragment, not a torn arm brought up in a fisherman's net, but a whole, living, actively moving animal, drawn close enough to the submersible's cameras to be filmed clearly for several extraordinary minutes before it withdrew back into the darkness it had emerged from. You're not in the submersible yourself when it happens. That privilege belongs to Kubodera and the pilot alone, the vessel's interior far too cramped for any additional crew, but you're in the support room aboard the surface ship when the radio call comes through, and the sound that goes up around you, a mixture of disbelief and something close to reverence, is unlike anything you've heard in 3 weeks of increasingly weary routine. Mai Tanaka, beside you, has both hands pressed flat over her mouth, and you realise, watching her, that she's not making a sound at all, simply standing perfectly still, eyes fixed on the relay monitor as the first grainy, red-tinted footage of a living giant squid ever recorded begins to play back in real time. What the footage actually shows, once the whole crew has had time to review it properly in the hours and days following, adds genuine new understanding to a century and a half of accumulated but frustratingly incomplete science. The animal moves through the water with a fluid-controlled grace that contrasts sharply with the flailing, wounded thrashing every previous human encounter, Picot and Squires' hatchet fight. Booyah's 3-hour struggle off Tenerife had necessarily produced. Its arms, rather than the rigid, grasping posture popular imagination had long assumed, move with a delicate, almost searching quality, extending and retracting in patterns that suggest deliberate, purposeful hunting behaviour rather than simple aggression. The animal's size, measured as accurately as the footage and accompanying laser measurement equipment allowed, comes in at roughly 8 metres, smaller than the largest verified stranded specimens, but unmistakably, undeniably, the same species that had haunted 2 centuries of sailors' testimony, filmed at last exactly where it had always actually lived. Patient, unhurried, entirely undisturbed by its own legend. By the time the expedition wraps for the season, footage in hand, the crew's mood has shifted from grim professional patience into something closer to quiet, exhausted wonder, and you find yourself, on the last night aboard, standing at the rail the way you imagine sailors have stood at rails for centuries before you, not fearing the deep water below anymore. Exactly, but held by it in a way that feels unexpectedly close kin to the old fear itself. Mai tells you, that final night, that she'd grown up hearing her grandmother's own half remembered fragments of Japanese sea monster folklore, stories of vast creatures living in the deepest ocean trenches, and that some part of her, watching the footage play back for the first time, had felt less like a scientist confirming a hypothesis and more like a child finally getting proof that the story she'd been told as a girl had been, in its own way, more true than anyone had given it credit for. That's the thread worth holding on to as this particular chapter closes, and it's the same thread that's run underneath every single account this whole evening has traced. From a Norwegian bishop's careful testimony to a French warship's exhausted crew, the deep ocean was never actually empty. Never actually just a blank space on a chart waiting to be filled in with human fear and human imagination. It was full, the entire time, of something genuinely extraordinary, patiently living out its own existence in darkness too complete and too deep for most of human history to ever properly witness. It took 260 years, from Bishop Pontoppidan's first careful collection of fishermen's testimony to Kubadera's patient red light camera finally catching the animal on its own terms, for that gap to close even partially, and even now, with footage finally in hand, the giant squid's full life, its actual behaviour across the whole of its existence in water still far too deep and far too dark for regular human observation, remains only partially understood, waiting, the way it always has, for whoever's patient enough to keep watching. There's a piece of the expedition's broader context worth adding here. Because the July 2012 dive wasn't actually the very first time a living giant squid had ever been observed by human eyes, it was, more precisely, the first time one had been filmed at natural depth, undisturbed, behaving as itself rather than as an animal already in distress. 8 years earlier, in September of 2004, the same Dr. Kubadera, working with a colleague named Kyoichi Mori, had achieved a related but distinct milestone, capturing the first still photographs of a live giant squid in its natural habitat, using a baited camera rig lowered to similar depths off the same general stretch of Japanese coastline, documenting the animal attacking the baited line and, in the process, losing a portion of one tentacle in the struggle to escape. That 2004 breakthrough had been genuinely significant in its own right, finally providing photographic proof of a living, actively hunting giant squid after a century and a half of exclusively post-mortem evidence. But it had also left the scientific community wanting more, hungry for actual moving footage that could reveal something about the animal's ordinary behaviour rather than its reaction to being hooked. The 2012 expedition, in other words, wasn't chasing an entirely unprecedented goal. It was chasing the next, harder, more complete version of a goal Kubadera himself had already partially achieved once before, refining the method, refining the technology. Refusing to settle for good enough when something considerably more complete still felt within reach. That persistence deserves its own moment of genuine admiration, separate from the footage itself, because it says something about the particular kind of patience real scientific discovery actually requires. A patience that has more in common with Corwin Ashey's 22 years of accumulated ritual, or Cudjoe's calm, practiced rationing through a week-long calm, than most people would immediately assume. Kubadera had been pursuing evidence of the living giant squid for the better part of his entire career by the time the 2012 footage finally came through, weathering years of expeditions that produced nothing at all, refining his methods dive by dive, failure by failure, the same way a ship's quartermaster refines the exact ritual that keeps a crew steady across dozens of increasingly difficult voyages. Science, at its most honest, rarely moves in the sudden dramatic leaps popular retellings prefer. It moves the way this whole expedition moved, one unsuccessful dive at a time, until dive 29 finally, after weeks of nothing, produced something extraordinary. By the fourth week aboard, with the footage safely recorded and the initial wave of excitement beginning to settle into the more careful, methodical work of review and verification, you find yourself with time enough to properly reflect on just how strange the whole arc of this evening's subject actually is, viewed end to end. A Norwegian bishop, gathering fishermen's testimony by candlelight in the 1750s, working from nothing but second-hand accounts and an honest willingness to take his witnesses seriously despite having no way to verify a word of it. A Newfoundland minister, more than a century later, purchasing a severed arm from two shaken fishermen and photographing it in his own home because he understood immediately what the specimen actually meant. A French naval commander fighting an exhausting 3-hour battle against an animal his own crew could barely comprehend, bringing home 40 pounds of proof and enduring years of scientific mockery before vindication finally arrived. A Royal Navy captain defending his own professional integrity in the pages of London newspapers against one of the era's most respected anatomists, for an animal that, a century and 3/4 later, still isn't fully identified with certainty. And now this, a Japanese marine biologist and an American bioluminescence researcher, patient enough and clever enough to finally close a gap in human knowledge that had remained stubbornly, frustratingly open for 260 years, using nothing more forceful than a red light and a carefully engineered electronic jellyfish. None of these people knew each other. Most of them were separated by continents, by centuries, by entirely different scientific frameworks and entirely different reasons for caring about the answer in the first place. And yet every single one of them was, in the end, doing the exact same thing, taking the deep ocean's oldest, most persistent secrets seriously enough to keep investigating it honestly, refusing either to dismiss the testimony that came before them or to simply accept it uncritically, insisting instead on the slow, unglamorous, frequently unrewarding work of actually finding out. That thread, honest, patient, generationally inherited curiosity turns out to matter considerably more to this whole story than any single dramatic encounter, however thrilling any one chapter of it might have been to hear told. There's a final image worth sitting with before this last chapter closes. One May describes to you on that final night at the rail, watching the dark water slide past the hull in exactly the same rhythm that would have been familiar to any pirate crew working these same general latitudes 2.5 centuries earlier. She tells you that somewhere in the footage, a detail that didn't make it into any of the official scientific reports, simply something she noticed herself, reviewing the recording frame by frame during the long editing process that followed the expedition. There's a moment, brief, lasting perhaps 2 or 3 seconds, where the giant squid's enormous eye turns directly toward the camera. Holding there, before the animal withdraws unhurriedly back into darkness. Nobody can say with any confidence what that moment actually represents from the animal's own perspective, whether it constitutes anything resembling curiosity or simple sensory orientation toward an unfamiliar light source, or nothing at all beyond ordinary reflexive behaviour a human observer is simply projecting meaning onto. But May tells you she's watched that specific 2 or 3 seconds more times than she could reasonably count, and that every single time it produces in her the exact same feeling, the unmistakable, almost vertiginous sense of being looked at, in return, by something that had spent 260 years being looked for. That's the note this final chapter leaves you on, standing at the rail on the expedition's last night, the generator's hum finally quiet beneath your feet as the ship idles at anchor, not resolution exactly. Because the giant squid's full life remains only partially understood even now, its deepest behaviours and its full range across the ocean still largely a mystery no single expedition could hope to close completely. But something close enough to resolution to matter, the long, patient thread connecting a Norwegian bishop's careful testimony to a modern camera's red-tinted footage finally, after 2.5 centuries, drawn taut enough to hold. Proof at last that the old fear had never really been foolishness. It had only ever been an honest, disciplined respect for something genuinely real, waiting the whole time in the dark for someone patient enough, and gentle enough, to finally come looking the right way. You think, standing there, about Nathaniel Vance touching the ship's rail before going below to sleep, and about Corwin Ashey's 22 years of small accumulated rituals, and about Cudjoe measuring water twice a day through a becalmed week, with a patience that had nothing to do with superstition and everything to do with simple, practiced discipline. None of them ever got the answer you watched come through on a relay monitor this week. They lived and worked and, in some cases, died without ever knowing for certain whether the thing they respected in the dark water beneath their keel was real in the specific way their fear imagined it, or real in some entirely different way they had no framework to guess at, or not quite real at all in any form science would eventually recognise, and yet the respect itself passed hand to hand across 2 centuries of ships and crews and quiet shipboard rituals, turned out to have been pointed at something true the entire time. That's a strange kind of comfort to carry off an expedition like this one, not that the old sailors were right about every specific detail, because they mostly weren't, but that the discipline underneath their fear, the simple decision to take the deep ocean seriously rather than dismiss it, turned out to be exactly the right instinct, inherited and refined across 260 years until it finally, patiently, met its answer. The equipment gets packed away methodically over the final 2 days aboard, May and the rest of the technical crew running through the same careful checklists you'd watched them run 100 times before, except now, with the particular unhurried satisfaction of people whose long uncertain effort has finally undeniably paid off. There's no dramatic celebration, no champagne uncorked on deck the way popular imagination might expect from a scientific breakthrough of this scale. Mostly just quiet handshakes, a shared meal that runs a little longer than usual, and the ordinary practical business of preparing a research vessel for its return to port. It strikes you, watching it unfold, how much this quiet, undramatic closing has in common with the end of a pirate voyage 2.5 centuries earlier. No fanfare, no monument, just tired, capable people packing away their tools and turning, already, toward whatever comes next. The ocean doesn't perform its revelations for an audience. It simply, eventually, allows itself to be seen by whoever stays patient enough, humble enough, and respectful enough to keep watching long after most people would have given up entirely. Somewhere off the Norwegian coast, in water Bishop Pontoppidan's fishermen once swore rose beneath them without warning, that same water is rising and falling tonight exactly the way it always has. Tides, mostly, current, and the ordinary physics of a planet that never needed a monster's help to move its oceans. and somewhere considerably deeper than any 18th century fishing line could ever have reached, something with an eye the size of a dinner plate is very possibly drifting through total darkness right now, entirely unaware that it spent 260 years as the most feared, most argued over animal in the maritime world, and unaware too that it was finally gently found. That's the shape this whole story takes, once you step back from it. Not a monster hunted down and conquered, but a very old fear slowly given an answer it never demanded. Nathaniel Vance touching the rail before he went below, Cudjoe measuring water twice a day through a becalmed week, Corwin Ashey's tattoo needle and his sister's name updated on every fresh set of articles, Captain McQueehey staking his career on 20 honest minutes at sea, a French crew hauling 40 pounds of proof from 3 exhausting hours of struggle, a patient scientist and a red light nobody had thought to try, drawing 260 years of argument quietly to a close. None of them needed the fear to be tidy. They only needed it respected. Not with certainty, but with ritual, with rationing, with a hand on the rail in the dark, and the plain, stubborn discipline of taking deep water seriously, even when nobody could prove exactly why. You're a long way from any of it tonight. No watch to stand, no articles to sign, no rail within reach before you sleep, just the low hum of your own room, and the weight of a very old ocean finally, quietly, settling. You're warm. You're dry. The water outside your window isn't rising. You're safe. You're still. Whatever waits in the deep is, tonight, very far away, and was never once waiting for you. Sleep now. The old fear found its answer. The rest is just the tide, going on the way it always has. You're warm. You're safe. Tonight, that's enough.